Carl Jung explained, 7 traits of the detached soul that becomes unbreakable. In the deepest chamber of the psyche, where silence holds court over the cacophony of 1,000 unfulfilled longings, there exists a moment of profound rupture, a sacred tearing that announces the beginning of all authentic transformation. This is not the gentle separation of lovers who drift apart in sleep, nor the gradual weathering of stone by patient rain. This is the lightning strike that splits the oak of consciousness down its very heartwood, revealing the hollow spaces where we have stored our borrowed dreams and counterfeit identities. The soul, in its infinite wisdom, knows when the time has come for this great severing. It does not announce itself with fanfare or ceremony, but arrives like the first crack in winter ice, subtle, inevitable, and utterly transformative. One morning you wake to discover that the world's promises taste like ash in your mouth. The golden threads that once bound you to the theater of social performance have frayed beyond repair, and you find yourself standing in a landscape suddenly foreign, suddenly true. This is the Nigredo, the blackening that alchemists knew must precede all genuine transmutation. Jung understood this darkness not as pathology, but as portal, the necessary descent into the fertile void where the ego's desperate strategies finally exhaust themselves against the immutable laws of psychological truth. Here, in this primordial night of the soul, we encounter the first sacred teaching, that all authentic power begins with the courage to stand alone with our own depths. The severing comes first as loss of the comfortable fictions that once cushioned our days, loss of the easy certainties that made decision-making feel like following a well-worn path through familiar woods. The external world, with its endless demands for participation and performance, suddenly feels like a language we have forgotten how to speak. The parties feel hollow, the conversations seem to circle the same shallow pools, and the achievements that once brought such satisfaction now feel like monuments to a stranger's ambitions. But this is not depression, though it may wear depression's mask. This is initiation, the soul's declaration that it will no longer accept the substitutes we have offered it in place of authentic nourishment. The detached one begins to notice how much energy was being consumed in the constant translation between inner truth and outer acceptability, how exhausting it was to live perpetually in the gap between who you are and who you believed you needed to be to remain welcome in the world's grand carnival. In this space of sacred disconnection, time itself begins to move differently. The urgency that once drove you through your days, that relentless internal taskmaster insisting that every moment must be filled, every silence conquered, every pause justified, begins to lose its tyrannical hold. You discover that you can sit with emptiness without immediately rushing to fill it with distraction or accomplishment. This is perhaps the first miracle of detachment, the recognition that you are not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. The world, accustomed to your eager participation, may interpret this withdrawal as rejection or depression. Others may offer well-meaning advice about getting back out there, about not isolating yourself, about the importance of maintaining connections. But the detached soul has touched something that transcends the conventional wisdom of extroverted culture. It has discovered that there is a quality of solitude that is not loneliness, but wholeness, a being with oneself that is more nourishing than any external relationship, that requires you to abandon your essential nature. This is where the real work begins. In the silence between the heartbeats of social obligation, in the pause between the inhale of external stimulation and the exhale of authentic response, a new kind of awareness begins to dawn. The detached soul starts to notice the difference between hunger and craving, between genuine need and conditioned want, between love and the desperate attempt to extract love from unwilling or incapable sources. The severing is not complete in a single moment, but unfolds like a slow-blooming flower of consciousness. Each day brings new recognition of the ways in which you have been living in borrowed time, following scripts written by voices that were never your own. The career path that seemed so logical now reveals itself as a beautiful prison. The relationships that felt so necessary show themselves as elaborate systems of mutual need that left little room for authentic encounter. The goals that once burned so brightly in your imagination appear now as distant stars in a constellation you no longer recognize as your own. This recognition brings with it a grief that is both terrible and sacred. You mourn not only what you are leaving behind, but what you never actually had, the genuine connection that was obscured by the performance of connection, the authentic joy that was buried beneath the obligation to appear joyful, the real intimacy that was sacrificed for the appearance of intimacy. This grief is the compost from which new life will eventually spring. But first it must be felt fully, honored completely, allowed to move through the system like a cleansing storm. The detached one begins to understand that the severing is not an ending but a beginning. Not the death of connection but the death of false connection. Not the abandonment of love but the refusal to accept substitutes for love. In the spaciousness that opens when you stop chasing external validation, you discover that there is an internal source of meaning that has been waiting patiently for your attention. This source does not depend on others' recognition or approval. It exists independent of achievement or failure, success or disappointment. Here, in this virgin territory of authentic selfhood, the soul begins its real education. It learns to distinguish between the voice of ego, that anxious narrator constantly comparing and competing and calculating, and the deeper voice of self, which speaks in whispers and symbols and sudden knowing. The ego's voice is always urgent, always insisting on immediate action or reaction. The self's voice is patient, willing to wait for the right moment, content to communicate through dreams and synchronicities and the subtle movements of intuition. The great severing teaches the soul about its own sovereignty, in the absence of external authorities telling it how to think and feel and be. It must learn to navigate by its own internal compass. This is frightening at first. The ego has been trained to seek guidance outside itself, to look to others for confirmation that it is moving in the right direction. But as the detached soul sits longer in its solitude, it begins to trust the wisdom that emerges from stillness, the clarity that comes when the noise of others' expectations finally quiets. This is the laboratory of individuation, where the soul begins the slow, painstaking work of separating what is truly its own from what it has inherited or absorbed from the collective. Like an archaeologist carefully brushing away layers of sediment to reveal ancient treasures, the detached one begins to uncover aspects of self that have been buried beneath years of adaptation and accommodation. Gifts that were discouraged in childhood begin to stir again. Dreams that were abandoned for more practical pursuits start to whisper their forgotten promises. The severing reveals itself as an act of profound self-respect, the soul's refusal to continue betraying its essential nature for the dubious reward of fitting in. It is the recognition that no external achievement can compensate for the violence of self-abandonment, that no relationship can heal the wound of not knowing who you truly are beneath all the roles and expectations and inherited beliefs about how life should be lived. In this initiation into authentic solitude, the detached soul discovers that it is not lacking but overflowing, not empty but too full of its own undiscovered riches to have room for the world's counterfeits. The silence that once felt like absence reveals itself as presence, the profound presence of your own being with itself, unmediated by the need to translate or perform, or justify its existence to anyone else. The great severing, then, is not a wound, but a surgery, the careful removal of everything that is not essentially you, everything that has been grafted onto your authentic nature by well-meaning but unconscious forces. What remains is raw and tender, like new skin growing over a healed injury, but it is genuine in a way that the old self never was. It breathes with its own rhythm, moves according to its own impulses, responds to life from its own center rather than from the anxious periphery of others' expectations. This is the beginning of the end of psychological exile, the long journey home to your own soul. The detached one stands at the threshold of this journey, having severed the umbilical cords that once connected it to the external sources of meaning and validation. Ahead lies the uncertain but thrilling prospect of discovering who you are when you are not trying to be anyone else, what you want when you are not wanting what you think you should want, how you love when you are not loving from fear or need or the desperate hope of being loved in return. The great severing prepares the soul for this adventure by teaching it that it can survive the absence of external support, that it contains within itself everything necessary for its own becoming. Like the seed that must split open to release the plant growing within it, the detached soul has broken through the hard shell of false identity and is ready to reach toward its own light. The wound has become a doorway. The ending has revealed itself as a beginning, and the great work of becoming who you have always been can finally commence in earnest. The autumn of the soul arrives not with the calendar's turning, but with the first tremor of recognition, that moment when you catch sight of yourself in an unguarded mirror and see a stranger wearing your face. The persona, that elaborate costume we have tailored so carefully to meet the world's expectations, begins to feel like clothing borrowed from someone else's closet. The seams strain, the fabric chafes, and what once felt like second skin now reveals itself as an elaborate disguise that has forgotten its own theatrical nature. This is the season of sacred shedding, when the detached soul begins the delicate archaeology of removing layer upon layer of accumulated identity. Like the snake that must shed its skin or die, like the tree that must release its leaves to survive the winter's stripping, the soul in detachment discovers that what it took to be its essential nature was merely the outermost garment, beautiful perhaps, functional certainly, but ultimately expendable in service of something far more vital growing beneath. Jung understood the persona as both necessity and trap, the social face we must wear to navigate the collective world, yet also the mask that can become so convincing we forget we are wearing it. In the beginning, we craft this false face with such care, such artistic attention to detail. We study the successful, the beloved, the admired, and we learn to mirror their expressions, adopt their gestures, speak their language of acceptable ambition and appropriate desire. The persona becomes our masterpiece, our ticket to belonging, our insurance policy against the terror of rejection. But the detached soul has reached the shores of a new country, where these old passports no longer grant entry. In the silence that follows the great severing, the persona begins to feel not like protection, but like suffocation. The smile that once came so easily now requires conscious effort. The enthusiasm that once felt genuine now tastes metallic in the mouth. The conversations that once flowed like water now feel like trudging through thick mud, each word heavy with the weight of its own artifice. This dissolution does not come as dramatic revelation, but as gradual erosion, like limestone worn smooth by centuries of patient water. One day you notice that you have stopped laughing at jokes that aren't funny. Another day you realize you have been nodding in agreement, with opinions that make your soul recoil. Slowly, imperceptibly, the automatic responses that once governed your social interactions begin to malfunction, and in their breakdown, something truer begins to emerge. The first stage of this dissolution is often marked by a profound disorientation. Who are you when you are not performing the role that has defined you for so long? The successful professional discovers she has no idea what she actually enjoys when she's not trying to impress colleagues or climb hierarchical ladders. The devoted friend realizes he has been so busy being what others needed that he has forgotten what he himself needs from friendship. The perfect child, now grown, finds herself paralyzed by the simplest choices when there is no parent to please or rebel against. This confusion is not a mistake to be corrected, but a necessary passage through the wilderness of not knowing. In this desert of dissolved identity, the soul learns to tolerate the anxiety of existing without a clear definition, without a ready-made answer to the question, "Who are you?" The ego, terrified of this groundlessness, may attempt to quickly construct a new persona, the spiritual seeker, the rebel, the wounded healer. But the wise, detached soul resists these premature crystallizations, knowing that any identity assumed too quickly will be just another costume, more subtle perhaps, but equally limiting. The dissolution of persona reveals the enormous energy that was being consumed in this endless performance. Like an actor finally allowed to leave the stage after a marathon production, the detached soul experiences both relief and a strange sort of emptiness. All that effort that went into maintaining the character, all that vigilant attention to whether you were playing the part convincingly, all that constant adjustment and refinement of your public face, suddenly that energy is available for other purposes, but you have forgotten what those other purposes might be. In this interim space between the old false self and the emerging true self, the soul often encounters what feels like psychological nakedness. Stripped of the familiar armor of role and reputation, you may feel exposed, vulnerable, almost transparent. This is the dark night of the persona, when you realize that you have been hiding not only from others, but from yourself, using your social mask as a way to avoid the terrifying intimacy of your own authentic presence. But this nakedness, however frightening, is also where the real work begins. Without the buffer of persona, you begin to feel life directly, unfiltered through the lens of how it might appear to others. Emotions arrive in their pure form, undomesticated by the need to be socially acceptable. Desires surface that you didn't know you were allowed to have. Opinions form that you didn't know you were permitted to hold. The world begins to register on instruments you had forgotten you possessed. The dissolution teaches the soul about the difference between authenticity and performance, even the performance of authenticity. You learn to recognize the subtle ways the ego attempts to co-opt this process of unmasking, turning it into yet another identity to master, the authentic one, the real one, the person who has transcended the need for personas. But true authenticity cannot be performed. It can only be lived, moment by moment, in the willingness to meet life as you actually are rather than as you think you should be. This is where the real terror lies, not in being rejected for who you are pretending to be, but in being seen for who you actually are. The persona offered the comforting illusion that if others rejected you, they were rejecting only the mask, leaving your true self safely hidden and therefore unharmed. But the dissolving of this protective layer means that any rejection now cuts to the bone. Any acceptance touches the quick of your being. Yet this vulnerability, however painful, is also the doorway to genuine intimacy. The detached soul begins to understand that real connection requires the courage of transparency, that love based on false presentation is not love at all, but a kind of mutual delusion. The relationships that can survive this dissolution are revealed as the ones worth keeping. Those that cannot were never truly relationships, but elaborate agreements to enable each other's self-deception. The soul learns to sit with the discomfort of not knowing how it is being perceived, not being able to control others' responses to its unmasked presence. This is perhaps the most difficult lesson of the dissolution, releasing the attachment to being liked, understood, or even correctly seen. The detached one discovers that the need for others' approval was not about love, but about the ego's desperate attempt to confirm its own existence through external validation. In the space where the persona used to live, something else begins to grow. Not a new mask, but a capacity for presence that does not need to be anything other than what it is. This presence is not performed but inhabited, not projected but simply allowed. It responds to situations from its own center rather than from calculations about what response would be most strategically advantageous. The dissolution reveals that what you took to be your personality was often just a collection of strategies for survival, adaptation, and advancement. Underneath these strategies lies something far more mysterious and uncontrollable. Your essential nature, your unique flavor of being human, your particular way of dancing with existence. This essence cannot be cultivated or improved. It can only be uncovered like a sculpture that already exists within the marble, waiting for everything that is not itself to be chipped away. The process of shedding the persona is not a single dramatic event, but a daily practice of choosing authenticity over approval, truth over strategy, presence over performance. Each day brings opportunities to notice when you are about to slip back into the old costume, when you are about to say what you think is expected rather than what is true, when you are about to smile when your soul wants to weep or agree when your heart wants to object. This daily discipline of dissolution teaches the soul about the difference between who it has been and who it is becoming. The old self, constructed from others' expectations and societal templates, begins to feel like a character from a book you read long ago, familiar but no longer relevant to your current story. The emerging self feels both foreign and familiar, like recovering a language you spoke fluently as a child, but had forgotten through years of speaking only the approved dialects of adulthood. The dissolution of persona is not about becoming someone new, but about becoming who you have always been beneath the layers of protective adaptation. It is archaeology of the spirit, the patient excavation of your own essential nature from beneath the sediment of conditioning and compliance. What emerges is not perfect or socially optimal, but genuine in a way that makes the old performances seem like elaborate forms of sleepwalking. In this season of sacred shedding, the detached soul learns that true strength lies not in having an impressive persona, but in being able to live without one, to meet each moment freshly rather than from a preset repertoire of responses. The person who emerges from this dissolution is not more likable or more successful in conventional terms, but they are more real, more present, more capable of authentic relationship with both themselves and others. This is the preparation for the deeper work ahead, the encounter with the shadow, the descent into the unconscious depths, the integration of all that has been rejected and denied. But first, the old structures must be dissolved. The familiar landmarks of identity must be allowed to crumble, and the soul must learn to navigate by the subtle compass of its own authentic nature, rather than by the external stars of others' expectations and approval. The autumn of the soul is complete when you can stand naked of persona without shame, when you can meet the world as you actually are rather than as you think you should be, when you can allow others to see you truly and trust that what is genuine in them will recognize what is genuine in you. This is the sacred gift of dissolution, the return to your own essential nature, stripped of everything that was never truly yours to begin with. In the deepest caverns of the psyche, where light fears to venture and the ego dares not claim dominion, there dwells a figure both terrible and magnificent, the shadow, that repository of all we have exiled from the kingdom of our acceptable selves. This is not the simple darkness of evil or the mere absence of light, but the rich, fertile darkness of the womb, the compost pile, the cave where diamonds form under impossible pressure. The detached soul, having severed its bonds with false belonging and dissolved the masks of persona, now stands at the threshold of this inner underworld, called to descend into the very depths it has spent a lifetime learning to avoid. The shadow is Jung's name for that aspect of personality which we have relegated to the unconscious, not because it is inherently negative, but because it did not fit the image we needed to maintain of ourselves, to survive in family, society, and our own self-concept. It is the repository of the unlived life, the unexpressed aspects of self that were too dangerous, too unacceptable, too threatening to our carefully constructed identity to be allowed conscious expression. Here lived the anger we were taught was unspiritual, the sexuality we learned was shameful, the selfishness we believed was sinful, the wildness we were convinced was unseemly. But the detached soul, in its newfound solitude, begins to sense that this shadow is not the enemy it was taught to believe, but perhaps the very ally it has been seeking without knowing it. In the silence that follows the dissolution of persona, when the familiar strategies of self-presentation have been stripped away, something else begins to stir in the darkness, a presence both foreign and familiar, like recognizing your own reflection in a funhouse mirror that distorts even as it reveals truth. The first encounter with the shadow often comes as shock, the sudden recognition that you are capable of thoughts, feelings, and impulses that completely contradict your cherished self-image. The compassionate helper discovers a well of rage at those she has been serving. The mild-mannered professional uncovers fantasies of power and domination that would terrify his colleagues. The spiritual seeker finds herself consumed with envy for those who seem to navigate the material world with ease and success. This recognition brings with it what Jung called the moral problem, the devastating realization that you are not who you thought you were, that the goodness you believed defined you was achieved through the systematic suppression of everything that didn't fit your idealized self-portrait. The ego, confronted with evidence of its own incompleteness, often reacts with horror and attempts to push these unwelcome revelations back into the darkness where they came from. But the detached soul, seasoned by its journey through severing and dissolution, has learned to sit with discomfort in a way that the defended ego cannot. It begins to approach the shadow not as prosecutor seeking to condemn, but as curious explorer seeking to understand. What if these rejected aspects of self carry not just problems, but also gifts? What if the very qualities we have been taught to despise in ourselves contain the seeds of our greatest strengths? The shadow work begins with what seems like the most impossible task, learning to love what we have hated in ourselves. This is not the sentimental love that excuses or justifies, but the fierce love that can look directly at difficult truths without flinching, the compassionate love that can hold our contradictions without needing to resolve them immediately into some false harmony. It is the love that says, yes, this too is part of me, even when this includes impulses and capacities that challenge everything we thought we knew about our essential nature. In the sanctuary of detachment, where the need to maintain appearances has been released, the shadow can finally be encountered safely. away from the judging eyes of others and freed from the compulsive need to present only our best self, we can begin the dangerous intimacy of getting to know our own complexity. This is laboratory work of the highest order, the careful, patient examination of our own psychological DNA, including the genes we have inherited from generations of ancestors who struggled with the same fundamental human contradictions we face today. The detached soul discovers that the shadow often contains the very qualities it most needs for wholeness and authentic power. The people-pleaser finds in her shadow the capacity for healthy selfishness, the ability to say no, the fierce protection of her own boundaries that she has been seeking in self-help books and therapy sessions. The cerebral intellectual discovers in his shadow the animal wisdom of instinct, the capacity for spontaneous response, the embodied intelligence that no amount of analysis could provide. This is the great paradox of shadow work, that what we most fear in ourselves often contains what we most need. The anger we have suppressed may be the very force that will finally motivate us to change what needs changing. The sexuality we have shamed may be the creative life force that energizes our deepest work. The aggression we have denied may be the warrior energy that enables us to fight for what we truly value. The shadow teaches the detached soul about psychological ecology, the understanding that a psyche, like any natural system, requires diversity to remain healthy. The attempt to maintain psychological monoculture, to be only good or only nice or only spiritual, creates the same kind of brittleness and vulnerability that we see in agricultural systems that have eliminated all but one crop. The shadow insists on biodiversity of the soul, the integration of seemingly opposite qualities that together create resilience and wholeness. In the depths of solitude, the detached one begins to understand that the shadow is not separate from the light, but intimately connected to it, that our greatest strengths often cast the darkest shadows, that our most noble qualities often generate their own distortions and blind spots. The person who prides themselves on their generosity may discover a shadow of resentment toward those who don't appreciate their gifts. The individual who values their independence may uncover a shadow of loneliness and secret longing for dependence. This recognition leads to what Jung called the conjunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites that is the goal of all psychological integration. The detached soul learns to hold paradox without rushing to resolve it, to contain contradictions without being torn apart by them. This is not the false wholeness of denial or spiritual bypassing, but the mature wholeness that can acknowledge, I am capable of both cruelty and kindness, both selfishness and generosity, both wisdom and foolishness. The shadow work reveals itself as an ongoing relationship rather than a one-time integration. Like any intimate relationship, it requires daily attention, honest communication, and the willingness to be surprised by new revelations. The detached soul learns to check in with its shadow regularly, not as enemy surveillance, but as friendly inquiry. What are you trying to tell me? What do you need? What am I avoiding or suppressing that wants to be acknowledged? This internal dialogue transforms the shadow from adversary to advisor. The rejected aspects of self begin to serve as early warning systems, alerting consciousness to imbalances before they become destructive. The suppressed anger signals when boundaries are being violated. The denied sexuality points to where life force is being blocked. The hidden selfishness reveals where self-care has been neglected in favor of compulsive giving. The detached soul discovers that shadow integration is not about acting out every impulse or giving free rein to every rejected aspect, but about conscious relationship with the full spectrum of human possibility. It learns to channel the energy of anger into effective action, to transform the wisdom of selfishness into healthy self-advocacy, to alchemize the power of aggression into fierce compassion for what needs protection. This transformation requires what the alchemists called the opus contra naturam, work against nature, or more precisely, work against what we have been conditioned to believe is natural or acceptable. It means developing capacity to value what culture has taught us to devalue, to find beauty in what society has labeled ugly, to discover strength in what we have been convinced is weakness. The shadow teaches the detached soul about authentic authority, not the borrowed authority of position or role, but the inherent authority that comes from knowing and accepting the full range of your own human nature. When you are no longer afraid of your own darkness, you are less likely to be controlled by others' manipulation of that fear. When you have made peace with your own capacity for selfishness, you are less vulnerable to those who would exploit your compulsive giving. In the depths of shadow work, the detached soul often encounters what Jung called the treasure hard to attain, gifts and capacities that were buried along with the rejected aspects of self. The artist who suppressed her rebellious nature discovers that this same rebelliousness is essential to genuine creativity. The leader who denied his sensitivity finds that this quality is crucial for authentic authority. The healer who rejected her own need for healing realizes that this wounded aspect is the source of her deepest compassion. The shadow work is never complete, for the human psyche is too complex and mysterious to ever be fully mapped. But the detached soul learns to approach this incompleteness not as failure but as infinite possibility. Each new encounter with the shadow brings new opportunities for integration, new resources for dealing with life's challenges, new dimensions of selfhood to explore and embrace. This ongoing relationship with the shadow transforms the detached soul's relationship to conflict, both internal and external. Instead of seeing opposition as something to overcome or eliminate, it begins to understand conflict as conversation, resistance as information, problems as invitations to greater wholeness. The shadow teaches that what we fight against often contains what we most need to learn, that our enemies often mirror our unlived possibilities. The detached soul emerges from this encounter with the shadow not purified but enriched, not simplified but complexified, not perfected but made whole through the integration of imperfection. It carries within itself the knowledge that it is capable of both great beauty and terrible destruction, both selfless love and ruthless selfishness, both profound wisdom and stunning foolishness. This knowledge becomes not burden but blessing, not cause for shame but source of genuine humility and authentic power. The shadow's wisdom whispers its final teaching to the detached soul. That wholeness is not the absence of darkness but the conscious relationship with it. That strength comes not from perfection but from the courage to be imperfect in full view of one's own consciousness, that the very qualities we most fear in ourselves may be the ones that hold the keys to our deepest fulfillment and most authentic service to the world. In embracing the shadow, the detached soul completes another crucial stage of its journey toward individuation. It has learned to love what it once hated, to find wisdom in what it once considered folly, to discover strength in what it once believed was weakness. This integration prepares it for the even deeper work ahead, the descent into the collective unconscious, the encounter with the archetypal forces that shape all human experience, the ultimate confrontation with the mystery of existence itself. In the sacred silence of your detachment, something begins to stir. Not the restless agitation of unfulfilled longing, but the deep trembling of recognition that announces the soul's most ancient ceremony. Here, in this hallowed vessel of solitude you have created, the great work commences. The alchemists called it the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage, and they knew what we are only beginning to remember, that the most profound union occurs not in the outer world of flesh and form, but in the secret chambers of the psyche, where opposing forces converge to birth something entirely new. Listen carefully to the whispers rising from your depths. Can you hear them? The voice of your inner masculine, that focused beam of consciousness that cuts through illusion with the sword of discernment, calling to its eternal partner. And there, responding from the shadows, the fluid wisdom of your inner feminine, that receptive vessel of intuition and feeling that holds the mysteries of becoming. These are not mere psychological concepts to be understood intellectually. They are living energies within you, archetypal forces that have been dancing their cosmic ballet since consciousness first emerged from the primordial darkness. Your detachment has created the perfect conditions for their encounter, like mercury and sulfur in the alchemist's retort. These polarities require the heat of isolation to begin their transformation. In the crowded marketplace of your former life, when you still sought completion in others, these inner voices were drowned out by the cacophony of external validation and the desperate music of need. But now, in this crucible of chosen solitude, they can finally hear each other's call across the vast landscape of your being. Watch how they approach each other, cautiously at first, like ancient lovers who have been separated by lifetimes of forgetting. Your animus, that inner masculine principle, emerges from the realm of logic and structure, bearing gifts of clarity and purpose. He has been the guardian of your boundaries, the architect of your ambitions, the warrior who fights for your place in the world. Yet he carries within his strength a secret wound, the loneliness of the pure masculine, forever reaching toward the feminine to complete his understanding of wholeness. And she, your anima, rises from the depths like Venus from the foam, bringing with her the treasures of the unconscious, the capacity for feeling, for connection, for the kind of knowing that transcends rational understanding. She is the muse and the witch, the mother and the virgin, the keeper of dreams and the weaver of meaning. In her flowing presence, rigid structures dissolve into organic becoming, and the heart's intelligence reveals truths that the mind cannot grasp alone. But do not mistake this for mere complementarity, as if you were simply joining two puzzle pieces to create a complete picture. The alchemy occurring within you is far more mysterious and transformative than such simplistic union. These forces do not merely combine, they interpenetrate, they challenge each other, they die into each other and are reborn as something that transcends both their original natures. Feel the tension building between them, the friction that generates the heat necessary for transformation. Your masculine principle wants to analyze, to control, to build structures of meaning that will last forever. Your feminine principle wants to flow, to feel, to dissolve boundaries and merge with the greater mystery. In their opposition lies their power, for it is precisely this dynamic tension that creates the energy needed for the great work of individuation. This is why your relationships of the past could never provide the completion you sought, not because they were flawed or insufficient, but because they were trying to substitute for an inner process that could only occur within the sacred vessel of your own being. When you sought your masculine in another person, you abandoned your inner animus to a state of projection and dependency. When you sought your feminine in external beauty or emotional connection, you left your anima orphaned in the unconscious, manifesting as moods and compulsions you could not understand. But now, in the alchemical laboratory of your detachment, a different kind of marriage becomes possible. It is not the marriage of need, where two incomplete beings attempt to create wholeness through merger, but the marriage of fullness, where your integrated masculine and feminine principles unite to create something greater than the sum of their parts. This is the hermaphroditic wisdom the alchemists spoke of. not the androgynous blur of undifferentiated consciousness, but the dynamic unity that contains and transcends all opposites. As this inner marriage deepens, notice how it transforms your relationship to the outer world, where once you approached others with the hunger of incompletion, seeking them to fill the void left by your abandoned inner nature, you now encounter them from a place of overflowing wholeness. Your masculine principle no longer needs to conquer or possess the feminine in others, for it has found its eternal partner in the depths of your own being. Your feminine principle no longer needs to surrender its power to the masculine in others, for it has discovered its own sovereign strength in union with your inner king. This transformation does not happen overnight, like some romantic fantasy of instant enlightenment. It unfolds slowly, like the seasons changing or a tree growing toward the light. There will be moments when your old patterns reassert themselves, when you feel the familiar pull toward external completion. The addictive mind will whisper its seductive promises. If only you had the right partner, the right job, the right circumstances, then you would be truly happy. These are the voices of the unintegrated psyche, the parts of you that have not yet learned to participate in the inner marriage. Be patient with these voices. They are not enemies to be conquered, but aspects of yourself that need to be welcomed into the sacred ceremony taking place within you. Your impatience is simply your masculine principle trying to rush the feminine process of organic unfolding. Your doubt is your feminine principle testing whether your masculine resolve is strong enough to hold the container for transformation. Even your resistance becomes part of the great work, for the alchemical marriage requires every aspect of your being to participate in the dance of union. In the deepest stages of this inner marriage, something remarkable occurs, the birth of what Jung called the divine child, the symbol of your renewed and integrated self. This child is neither masculine nor feminine, but contains the essence of both in a new synthesis that transcends gender altogether. It is the part of you that can act with decisive clarity while remaining open to feeling, that can think with precision while honoring intuition, that can be strong without being rigid and receptive without being passive. The divine child born of your inner marriage carries within it the seed of a new way of being in the world. It knows itself as both creator and created, both the artist and the work of art. It moves through life with the confident grace of one who has found the treasure that makes all other treasures optional. In its presence, relationships become sacred play rather than desperate need. Work becomes creative expression rather than survival strategy, and even solitude becomes a form of communion with the universal source of being. This is the true meaning of becoming unbreakable, not the brittle hardness of the defended ego, but the fluid strength of the integrated psyche. Like water that can flow around any obstacle while maintaining its essential nature, you learn to move through the challenges of existence without losing your center. The storms of life may rage around you, but at your core lies the still point where your inner masculine and feminine dance their eternal dance of creation. Watch how this transformation affects your very cells, your breathing, the way you carry yourself through space. There is a new dignity in your posture, a quiet confidence that comes not from achievement or recognition, but from the deep knowing that you are complete unto yourself. Your eyes hold a different light, not the hungry seeking of the incomplete soul, but the steady glow of one who has found the treasure hidden in their own depths. In this state of inner marriage, you begin to understand what the mystics meant when they spoke of the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites. You are simultaneously full and empty, active and receptive, individual and universal. These paradoxes no longer tear you apart, but become the very ground of your being. the dynamic tension that keeps you alive and growing. Your relationships with others transform as well. No longer approaching them as potential sources of completion, you meet them as fellow travelers on the path of individuation. Your love becomes unconditional, not because you have learned some moral principle, but because you no longer need others to be anything other than what they are. Your inner marriage has provided the completion you sought, leaving you free to appreciate the unique beauty of each soul without the distortion of projection. The masculine and feminine forces within you continue their dance, but it is no longer the desperate clinging of incomplete parts seeking wholeness. It has become the joyous celebration of fullness, recognizing itself in infinite forms. Your inner masculine honors the wisdom of your inner feminine without trying to control or understand it completely. Your inner feminine trusts the strength of your inner masculine without losing her own wild nature. This is the great secret hidden in the depths of detachment, that in learning to be alone with yourself, you discover you are never truly alone. The inner marriage reveals that within the temple of your being dwells not one consciousness, but a whole pantheon of divine energies, all seeking expression and integration. You become not a single note, but a full orchestra, not a monologue, but a cosmic dialogue. As the alchemy of inner marriage reaches its culmination, you understand why this process could only occur in the vessel of detachment. Like the alchemist's sealed retort, your solitude provided the perfect conditions for the transformation of base metal into gold, for the marriage of heaven and earth within the laboratory of your own soul. The unbreakable quality that emerges from this process is not the result of building walls against the world, but of discovering the inexhaustible source of love and creativity that flows from the union of your deepest opposites. You are the alchemist and the experiment, the seeker and the sought, the lover and the beloved. In the sacred marriage chamber of your heart, all dualities collapse into the singular truth of your integrated being, and from that integration flows the golden elixir of authentic existence, unshakable because it is grounded in wholeness, unbreakable because it has learned to embrace every aspect of the human condition with the fierce tenderness of divine love. In the aftermath of your inner marriage, as the dust of transformation settles into new patterns of being, you discover something that would seem impossible to the mind that once craved external validation. The deeper you retreat into the sanctuary of detachment, the more intimately connected you become to the vast ocean of feeling that flows through all existence. This is the great paradox that awaits every soul brave enough to walk the path of individuation, that in learning to need nothing from the emotional responses of others, you open yourself to everything that the human heart can possibly contain. But let us be clear about what is happening here, for the emotional mastery born of detachment is not what the world typically calls by that name. It is not the cold withdrawal of the defended ego, not the numbing that masquerades as wisdom, not the spiritual bypassing that pretends transcendence while avoiding the messy reality of incarnated existence. What emerges in the crucible of your solitude is something far more revolutionary, the capacity to feel everything while being possessed by nothing, to swim in the deepest waters of emotion while never losing sight of the shore of your essential self. Feel into this new relationship with your own emotional landscape, where once your feelings seemed like weather systems beyond your control, sudden storms of anger that would flood your consciousness, droughts of depression that would leave your soul parched and barren, hurricanes of passion that would uproot everything you thought you knew about yourself. Now you find yourself becoming the conscious observer of these inner climates. You are no longer the victim of your emotions, but their witness, no longer their prisoner, but their curious student. This shift does not happen through suppression or denial, those crude instruments of the ego that create only temporary peace at the cost of authentic aliveness. No, the mastery you are developing is far more subtle and infinitely more powerful. You are learning to expand your container of consciousness until it becomes large enough to hold the full spectrum of human feeling without being overwhelmed by any single wave in the ocean of experience. Watch how this transformation unfolds in the theater of your daily existence. A memory surfaces, perhaps of loss, of betrayal, of a dream that died before it could take wing, and instead of being swept away by the familiar current of reactivity, you find yourself able to meet this memory with a quality of presence that honors both its pain and its gift. You feel the sharp edge of grief, yes, but you also feel something else. The strange tenderness that emerges when consciousness learns to embrace what is rather than fighting what was. Your tears, when they come, carry a different quality now. They are no longer the tears of the victim who weeps for what life has taken away, but the tears of the mystic who weeps for the unbearable beauty of existence itself. They are sacred water, flowing from the depths of your being to irrigate the seeds of wisdom that can only grow in soil watered by authentic feeling. In these moments of conscious weeping, you touch something ancient and holy, the tears that every human soul must shed as it learns to love the world exactly as it is. And your anger, that most maligned and misunderstood of emotions, begins to reveal its secret nature in the alchemical vessel of your awareness. No longer the blind rage of the wounded child lashing out at a world that failed to meet its needs, your anger transforms into something the mystics have always known, holy fire, the sacred flame that burns away everything false and leaves only truth standing in its wake. This is not the destructive anger that seeks to punish or control, but the purifying fire that says no to what diminishes life and yes to what serves the highest good. In the crucible of detachment, you discover that anger is not the enemy of love, but its fierce protector, not the opposite of compassion, but its necessary complement. When you no longer need others to validate your worth, your anger becomes a clean sword that cuts through illusion without being stained by personal resentment. It becomes the voice of your deepest values, the guardian of your soul's integrity, the fire that lights the way when all other guidance fails. But perhaps the most profound transformation occurs in your relationship with joy. In your former life, joy was always contaminated by its own impermanence. You could never fully surrender to happiness because part of you was always bracing for its inevitable end. Joy was something you had to grasp and hold, something that could be taken away by changes in circumstance or the moods of others upon whom you depended for your sense of well-being. Now, in the spaciousness of your detached awareness, you begin to understand that joy is not an emotion that comes and goes like weather, but the natural fragrance of the integrated psyche. It is not something you achieve or attain, but something you uncover, like an archaeologist carefully brushing away the accumulated debris of conditioning to reveal the timeless treasure that was always there, waiting patiently beneath the surface. This joy does not depend on external conditions aligning with your preferences. It does not require others to behave in ways that please you or circumstances to unfold according to your plans. It is the joy of being itself, the quiet ecstasy that emerges when consciousness recognizes its own inexhaustible nature. It is the joy of the wave that suddenly remembers it is the ocean, the joy of the flame that realizes it is fire itself, dancing in temporary form but never separate from the eternal source of all light. In this state of emotional mastery, you begin to understand what the great teachers meant when they spoke of detachment not as withdrawal from life, but as the deepest possible engagement with existence. Your feelings become more vivid, not less. Your capacity for empathy expands, not contracts. Your ability to love grows beyond all previous boundaries, not because you have learned some technique or philosophy, but because you have removed the barriers that were blocking the natural flow of your own heart. Watch how this transformation affects your relationships with others. Where once their emotional states could hijack your inner peace, their anger triggering your defenses, their sadness pulling you into the quicksand of codependent rescuing, their joy somehow threatening because it reminded you of your own lack. Now you find yourself able to be present with their full emotional reality without losing your center. This is not the cold presence of the detached observer who stands apart from human suffering, but the warm presence of the integrated being who can swim in the deepest waters of emotion without drowning. You become like the mountain that remains stable while clouds pass across its peak, like the oak tree that bends with the wind while never losing its rootedness in the earth. Your compassion, freed from the distortions of projection and need, becomes a healing presence in the world. Others feel safe to reveal their authentic feelings in your company because they sense intuitively that you will not be overwhelmed by their pain or threatened by their joy. Your emotional mastery creates a sacred space where others can explore the depths of their own hearts without fear of judgment or abandonment. But this mastery extends beyond your relationships with others into the most intimate relationship of all, your relationship with yourself. You begin to notice the subtle ways you had been at war with your own emotional nature, the constant inner commentary that labeled some feelings as acceptable and others as problems to be solved. In the light of conscious awareness, these judgments dissolve like frost in the morning sun, leaving you free to experience the full range of human emotion without the overlay of resistance that had been causing so much unnecessary suffering. Fear, when it arises, is no longer the enemy to be conquered, but the guardian to be honored, the ancient wisdom that has kept humanity alive through countless generations of danger and uncertainty. In your detached awareness, you can feel fear's message without being paralyzed by its intensity, can receive its gift of caution without being imprisoned by its constraints. Sadness becomes a teacher rather than an affliction, a guide that leads you deeper into the mystery of what it means to love in a world where everything beautiful is also impermanent. In your expanded container of consciousness, sadness is not something to be fixed or bypassed, but something to be felt fully, allowed to wash through you like rain through an open meadow, cleansing and nourishing the soil of your being. Even your more challenging emotions, jealousy, envy, resentment, begin to reveal their hidden wisdom when met with the steady gaze of awareness. These feelings, you discover, are not signs of spiritual failure, but messengers from the unconscious, carrying information about unintegrated aspects of yourself that are seeking recognition and healing. Jealousy shows you what you have disowned in yourself and projected onto others. Envy reveals the dreams you have abandoned and the potential you have left unexpressed. Resentment points to the boundaries you have failed to maintain and the self-respect you have sacrificed on the altar of others' approval. In this new relationship with your emotional life, you become both the scientist and the subject of your own inner laboratory. You observe your feelings with the curiosity of the researcher and the compassion of the lover, learning the unique language that each emotion speaks and the specific gift that each one brings to the whole of your being. You develop what Jung called the feeling function, not mere emotionality, but the sophisticated capacity to evaluate experience based on its inherent value rather than its external reward. This emotional mastery manifests in the most practical aspects of your daily life. Decisions that once tormented you for weeks become clear in moments, not because you have developed some magical power of prediction, but because you have learned to listen to the deep intelligence of your feeling nature. Your emotions become allies in the quest for authentic living rather than obstacles to be overcome. When faced with a choice, you no longer need to poll your friends or analyze every possible outcome to exhaustion. Instead, you tune into the felt sense of each option, allowing your integrated emotional intelligence to guide you toward what serves your highest becoming. This is not the impulsive following of every passing feeling, but the mature capacity to distinguish between the reactive emotions of the ego and the deeper feeling tones that emerge from the self. Your emotional mastery becomes a form of artistry, a way of sculpting your life from the raw material of feeling and awareness. Like a master musician who has learned to play every note on the emotional scale with precision and beauty, you discover that life itself can become a symphony of conscious feeling, each emotion adding its unique voice to the greater harmony of your individuated existence. In the deepest stages of this mastery, you begin to touch the transpersonal dimensions of feeling, emotions that belong not just to your personal history, but to the collective human experience. Your grief becomes a gateway to the universal sorrow of all beings who have ever loved and lost. Your joy becomes a channel for the cosmic delight that dances through every moment of creation. Your anger becomes the righteous fire that burns on behalf of all who have been diminished or oppressed. This is where the paradox of emotional mastery reaches its culmination. In learning to feel your own feelings completely, you discover that there are no personal feelings at all, only individual expressions of the universal emotional currents that flow through all life. Your heart becomes a receiving station for the great broadcast of existence itself, and in that receptivity, you touch the source of all compassion, all wisdom, all love. The unbreakable quality that emerges from this emotional mastery is not the brittleness of the defended heart, but the resilience of the open heart that has learned to trust its own capacity to feel everything and be destroyed by nothing. You become like the ocean that can contain every river without losing its essential nature, like the sky that can hold every cloud without being stained by their shadows. In this vast emotional spaciousness, you discover the secret that the mystics have always known, that the human heart, when fully opened and consciously embraced, is not fragile but infinitely strong, not vulnerable but invulnerable in its very vulnerability, not breakable but eternally whole in its willingness to be broken open again and again by the magnificent intensity of being alive. In the deepest chambers of your detached solitude, where the inner marriage has consecrated your being and emotional mastery has transformed your heart into a vessel of conscious feeling, something extraordinary begins to emerge, a function of consciousness so rare and precious that Jung gave it a sacred name, the transcendent function. This is the crown jewel of individuation, the mysterious bridge that spans the chasm between opposing worlds, the cosmic weaver that takes the scattered threads of human experience and weaves them into patterns of meaning that no single perspective could ever comprehend. Listen to the silence that has grown within you, not the empty silence of the void, but the pregnant silence of infinite possibility. In this silence, a new kind of intelligence is awakening, one that does not belong to the rational mind with its need for linear logic, nor to the feeling function with its subjective valuations, but to a higher synthesis that transcends and includes both. This is the birth of your transcendent function, the miraculous capacity that allows consciousness to hold paradox without collapsing, to embrace contradiction without fragmenting, to dance between worlds without losing its essential center. The transcendent function does not emerge from effort or will, but from the organic unfolding of a psyche that has learned to trust its own deepest processes. like a flower that blooms only when all conditions are perfectly aligned, the right soil, the right season, the right quality of light. This function manifests only when the ego has surrendered its tyrannical need to control and the self has been given space to orchestrate its own mysterious symphony of becoming. Feel how this transcendent capacity first announces itself in your consciousness. Perhaps it comes as a sudden insight that bridges two seemingly irreconcilable aspects of your life. A flash of understanding that shows you how your greatest weakness has always been inseparable from your greatest strength. Or maybe it manifests as a dream that speaks in symbols. Your rational mind cannot decode, yet your deeper being understands perfectly, a nocturnal teaching that dissolves the artificial boundaries between sacred and profane, spiritual and psychological, personal and universal. This is not the transcendence of the spiritual bypasser who seeks to rise above the messy reality of human existence, nor the transcendence of the intellectual who believes that understanding can substitute for transformation. The transcendent function that emerges from your journey into detachment is a transcendence that includes everything, that finds the sacred not by escaping the profane, but by discovering the divine intelligence that weaves through every thread of earthly experience. Watch how this function operates in the laboratory of your daily existence, where once you experienced life as a series of either or choices, either success or failure, either love or independence, either security or adventure, you now find yourself accessing a third option that was invisible to your previous level of consciousness. This is not compromise, which is merely the ego's attempt to satisfy competing demands, but synthesis, which is the self's way of creating entirely new possibilities from the marriage of apparent opposites. You begin to understand that the rational and the mystical are not enemies locked in eternal combat, but dance partners in the cosmic ballet of consciousness. Your thinking function, once isolated in its tower of logic, discovers that it can embrace the non-linear wisdom of intuition without losing its capacity for clear analysis. Your feeling function, once drowning in the ocean of subjective experience, learns that it can welcome the clarifying light of reason without betraying its essential nature as the guardian of value and meaning. This is the true nature of the transcendent function. It does not choose sides in the ancient war between mind and heart, between spirit and matter, between individual and collective. Instead, it reveals that these apparent oppositions are really complementary aspects of a greater wholeness that can only be perceived from the expanded perspective of integrated consciousness. You become the living bridge between worlds, the conscious mediator between the many voices that speak within the parliament of your soul. In the realm of relationships, this transcendent capacity transforms your understanding of what it means to love another being. Where once you oscillated between the extremes of merger and separation, either losing yourself in the other or defending yourself against them, you now discover a third way that honors both intimacy and autonomy, both connection and freedom. You learn to love without possessing, to commit without clinging, to be deeply present without losing your essential self. This is not the detached love of the philosopher who observes from a safe distance, but the engaged love of the integrated being who can swim in the depths of relationship while never forgetting how to breathe. Your transcendent function allows you to hold the paradox of intimate love, that two beings can become one without ceasing to be two, that unity can emerge from difference rather than sameness, that the deepest connection occurs not through the elimination of boundaries, but through the conscious dance between separate centers of being. Your work in the world also transforms under the influence of this transcendent capacity. Where once you might have struggled between the demands of creative expression and practical necessity, between serving your own vision and meeting the needs of others, you now find ways of being that honor both seemingly contradictory requirements. Your transcendent function reveals that you do not have to choose between being an artist and being responsible, between following your passion and contributing to society, between honoring your individuality and serving something greater than yourself. You become a living demonstration of what Jung called the both-and consciousness that characterizes the individuated being. You are both spiritual and psychological, both personal and transpersonal, both grounded in earth and reaching toward heaven. These are not conflicting identities that create inner fragmentation, but complementary aspects of a consciousness that has learned to embody wholeness without sacrificing complexity. The transcendent function manifests as a quality of fluid strength that allows you to adapt to any situation without losing your essential nature. Like water that takes the shape of every container, while never ceasing to be water, you learn to respond to the unique requirements of each moment while remaining anchored in the unchanging core of your being. This is the secret of the unbreakable soul, not rigidity that resists change, but flexibility that can embrace all change while remaining essentially itself. In your relationship with time, the transcendent function reveals new dimensions of possibility, where once you experience time as a linear progression from past through present to future, you now begin to access what T.S. Eliot called the intersection of the timeless with time. Past and future collapse into an eternal now that somehow contains all possibilities simultaneously. Your decisions are informed not only by memory and projection, but by a direct knowing that emerges from your connection to the timeless dimension of consciousness. This temporal transcendence does not make you impractical or otherworldly. On the contrary, it makes you more effective in navigating the practical demands of existence because you are no longer imprisoned by the linear thinking that sees only one step at a time. Your transcendent function allows you to hold multiple time frames simultaneously, to sense the long-term implications of present choices while remaining fully engaged with immediate requirements. The transcendent function also transforms your relationship with suffering and joy, revealing them not as opposites to be chosen between, but as complementary movements in the great symphony of existence. You discover that the deepest joy often emerges from the depths of consciously embraced suffering, that the most profound peace can be found in the heart of welcomed chaos, that the greatest strength is born from the ashes of accepted defeat. This is not the masochistic embrace of suffering for its own sake, but the mature recognition that existence includes both light and shadow, both creation and destruction, both birth and death. Your transcendent function allows you to say yes to the whole of life, not just to the pleasant parts, and in that total acceptance, you find a peace that surpasses understanding and a joy that no circumstance can diminish. In the realm of creativity, the transcendent function becomes the source of genuine innovation and artistic breakthrough. Where once you might have been trapped in the either-or of tradition versus originality, technique versus inspiration, form versus freedom, you now find yourself accessing a creative space where all apparent opposites can dance together in service of authentic expression. Your art, whatever form it takes, becomes a bridge between worlds, personal yet universal, contemporary yet timeless, individual yet archetypal. Through the transcendent function, you discover that true creativity is not the product of the isolated ego, but the fruit of a consciousness that has learned to collaborate with the deeper intelligence that moves through all life. You become a conscious channel for the creative force itself, allowing it to express through your unique perspective, while never claiming ownership of its essential nature. The transcendent function reveals itself most powerfully in moments of crisis and transition, those threshold experiences where your old ways of being are no longer adequate, but your new identity has not yet fully emerged, where once you might have been torn apart by such liminal states, experiencing them as psychological emergencies to be resolved as quickly as possible. You now recognize them as sacred initiations into greater wholeness. In these moments of creative dissolution, your transcendent function becomes the still point around which transformation revolves. You learn to inhabit the space between stories, to dance in the gap between identities, to find stability in the very process of change itself. This is perhaps the most profound expression of the unbreakable quality, not the ability to resist transformation, but the capacity to remain conscious and centered while everything around you and within you is shifting into new configurations. The transcendent function also manifests as a new quality of presence that others sense immediately upon meeting you. There is something in your being that cannot be easily categorized or understood through conventional frameworks. You embody paradox so naturally that others find themselves drawn into a space where their own either-or thinking begins to dissolve. Your very presence becomes an invitation to transcendence, a living reminder that reality is far more mysterious and multidimensional than the ordinary mind can grasp. This presence is not something you cultivate or perform, but something that emerges naturally from your integrated state of being. You have become a walking bridge between worlds, and others intuitively recognize in you a quality of consciousness that they, too, are seeking to develop. Without preaching or teaching, you become a catalyst for the awakening of the transcendent function in others, a living demonstration of what becomes possible when consciousness learns to embrace its own infinite nature. As the transcendent function matures within you, you begin to experience what Jung called the reality of the psyche, the recognition that consciousness itself is not merely an epiphenomenon of matter, but a fundamental aspect of reality that participates in the ongoing creation of the universe. Your individual consciousness becomes a unique note in the cosmic symphony, both expressing the universal intelligence and contributing something entirely original to its unfolding. This realization does not inflate your ego, but dissolves it into a larger identity that encompasses both the personal and the transpersonal dimensions of existence. You remain fully yourself, with your unique history, personality, and creative gifts, while simultaneously recognizing your essential unity with all life. This is the final paradox that the transcendent function reveals, that individuation leads not to isolation but to communion, that becoming fully yourself is the doorway to recognizing your inseparable connection with everything that is. In the culmination of this transcendent awareness, you understand why your journey into detachment was not a retreat from life, but the deepest possible engagement with existence. By learning to stand in the center of your own being without needing validation or completion from external sources, you have created the space for consciousness to reveal its most precious gift, the capacity to bridge all worlds, to unite all opposites, to weave meaning from apparent meaninglessness, and to find the sacred thread that connects every fragment of experience into one seamless tapestry of becoming. You have become unbreakable not because you are hard, but because you are infinitely flexible, not because you resist change, but because you have learned to dance with transformation itself. In the transcendent function, you have discovered the secret that the mystics and depth psychologists have always known, that consciousness, when fully awakened to its own nature, is not separate from the creative intelligence that moves through all existence, but is its most intimate expression, forever weaving the world into new patterns of beauty, meaning, and love. There comes a moment in the soul's long journey when the very texture of caring begins to transform. Not the death of care, but its profound metamorphosis, like water becoming steam, still water yet wholly changed in its essential nature. You have walked through the fires of attachment, felt the searing pain of clinging to outcomes that dance always just beyond your grasp, and now you stand at the threshold of what the ancient ones called sacred indifference. This is not the cold withdrawal of the wounded heart, nor the bitter resignation of the defeated spirit. No, this is something far more mysterious, far more alive. Sacred indifference is love's most mature expression, the place where caring becomes so vast, so encompassing, that it no longer needs to possess what it loves. Like the sun that gives its light freely to all things without demanding gratitude or return, the soul learns to love with an open hand. The mystics knew this secret. They spoke of it in paradoxes that confound the mind but illuminate the heart. To love deeply, you must love without attachment. To care completely, you must care without condition. To hold tenderly, you must hold without grasping. These are not contradictions but revelations of love's deepest nature, that it is not a transaction but a state of being, not a doing but a way of existing in the world. Watch how the ocean loves the shore. See how it caresses the sand with endless devotion, yet never tries to possess the land. Each wave arrives with complete presence, touches with absolute tenderness, and then releases back into the vastness from which it came. The ocean does not grieve the withdrawal of each wave, for it knows itself as the eternal source from which all waves arise and to which they return. This is sacred indifference, not the absence of love, but love's recognition of its own infinite nature. In your own journey, you have felt the exhaustion of the ego's desperate strategies, how it schemes and plans, manipulates and controls, all in service of securing some imagined future happiness. The ego believes that if only it can arrange the pieces of life just so, if only it can ensure the right outcomes, then finally, it will be safe, complete, fulfilled. But each success brings only temporary relief before the anxiety of potential loss begins again. Each achievement becomes a new possession to defend, a new source of fear that it might slip away. Sacred indifference emerges as the soul's response to this futility, not giving up on life, but giving up on the exhausting project of trying to control life. It is the recognition that true security comes not from manipulating outcomes, but from resting in that which is unchanged by any outcome. The Buddha called it the middle way, not extreme asceticism that rejects the world, nor extreme indulgence that clings to it, but the balanced path that engages fully while holding lightly. This quality has been present in your deepest experiences of peace, though you may not have recognized it as such. Remember those moments when you felt completely present, perhaps watching a sunset, holding a sleeping child, sitting by a river. In those instances, there was care without craving, love without longing, presence without pressure. You were completely engaged, yet somehow free, completely committed, yet somehow liberated. This is the flavor of sacred indifference, and it has been teaching you all along. The Stoics understood this wisdom and called it the doctrine of preferred indifference. They recognized that while some things are naturally preferable, health over sickness, friendship over isolation, prosperity over poverty, true peace comes not from obtaining the preferable, but from maintaining equanimity regardless of what arises. They distinguish between what is up to us and what is not up to us, finding freedom in the recognition that only our responses, our attitudes, our inner stance toward life is truly within our control. But sacred indifference goes even deeper than Stoic acceptance. It is not merely philosophical resignation, but a profound transformation in the very structure of identity. The ego that seeks to control outcomes begins to dissolve into the larger self that recognizes itself as both the experiencer of outcomes and the unchanging awareness in which all outcomes appear and disappear. From this perspective, winning and losing are equally fascinating dramas playing out on the stage of consciousness, equally valuable as experiences of the infinite exploring itself through finite form. This shift often begins with exhaustion, the deep fatigue that comes when the ego finally admits that its strategies are not working, will never work, cannot work. This is not defeat, but the beginning of wisdom. Like a traveler who has been pushing against a door marked pull, the moment of recognizing the futility of force becomes the moment of discovering grace. The door that seemed so solid and resistant reveals itself to be already open, waiting only for the different approach that comes with sacred indifference. In relationships, this transformation is particularly profound. Love, which the ego experiences as need, begins to reveal itself as abundance. The desperate hunger for the other's approval, attention, affection, all the subtle ways the ego uses relationship to complete itself, gradually gives way to a love that loves for the sheer joy of loving. This is not detachment from others, but the deepest possible intimacy. For when you no longer need someone to be different than they are, you can finally see them as they actually are. The parent learns to love the child without needing the child to fulfill the parent's dreams. The lover learns to cherish the beloved without needing the beloved to provide identity or security. The friend learns to offer presence without needing friendship to fill some inner emptiness. This is love's maturation from taking to giving, from grasping to blessing, from possession to appreciation. Yet sacred indifference extends beyond human relationships to encompass your relationship with existence itself. The burning questions that once tormented the mind, why do I suffer? What is my purpose? How should I live? Begin to transform into a kind of sacred curiosity that is content to exist in mystery, not because the questions become unimportant, but because the questioner realizes that the deepest answers cannot be grasped by the mind, but must be lived by the whole being. There is a particular quality of attention that develops through this process, a way of being present that is both completely engaged and completely free, like the musician who has practiced scales for decades and can now play with effortless precision, allowing the music to flow through without the ego's interference. Or like the master craftsperson whose hands know their work so intimately that they can create beauty while the mind rests in spacious awareness. This is sacred indifference in action, full participation without the burden of attachment to results. The ego often fears this development, interpreting it as the death of passion, the end of caring, the slide into apathy. But those who have tasted sacred indifference know it as passion's purification, caring's expansion, engagement's liberation from the prison of outcomes. It is not that you cease to have preferences. You may still prefer kindness to cruelty, beauty to ugliness, truth to falsehood, but these preferences become like the weather of consciousness, natural, flowing, without the desperate grip of ego identification. In your daily life, sacred indifference might manifest as a new quality of decision-making, rather than the ego's anxious calculation of potential gains and losses. Decisions begin to arise from a deeper listening to what serves life, what aligns with love, what feels most authentic in the moment. You still choose, but the choosing comes from presence rather than projection, from wisdom rather than worry. This is the space where miracles become natural, not supernatural interventions in the laws of physics, but the natural flowering of possibility that occurs when the ego's resistance no longer constrains the flow of life through you. Synchronicities multiply, not because you are manipulating reality, but because you are no longer obstructing it. Opportunities appear not because you are grasping for them, but because you have become open to receiving them. The activist working for social change, from a place of sacred indifference, serves with equal dedication, but without the burnout that comes from attachment to timeline or outcome. The artist creates with equal passion, but without the anguish that comes from needing validation or commercial success. The seeker pursues truth with equal intensity, but without the suffering that comes from demanding that truth conform to preconceived notions. Sacred indifference is not a destination, but a way of traveling. It is not something you achieve once and possess forever, but rather a quality of being that must be cultivated, moment by moment, decision by decision, breath by breath. Like physical balance, it is not a static state, but a dynamic process of continuous adjustment, a dance between engagement and detachment, caring and letting go. The seasons demonstrate this principle with perfect clarity. Spring does not strain to push the flowers into bloom. They open naturally when conditions are right. Summer does not grasp at its own warmth. It gives freely until autumn's time arrives. Autumn does not resist the falling of leaves. It releases with such beauty that death becomes a celebration. Winter does not apologize for its dormancy. It rests completely, preparing for the next cycle of renewal. In your own seasons of growth and rest, expansion and contraction, joy and sorrow, sacred indifference allows you to move with the same natural grace, not forcing outcomes but allowing them to unfold, not resisting change but flowing with it, not demanding permanence but appreciating the eternal within the temporary. This quality transforms your relationship with time itself. The ego lives in constant tension between memory and anticipation, rarely able to rest in the present moment without immediately wanting to move somewhere else. Sacred indifference reveals the present as the only place where life actually exists, the only moment where choice is possible, the only now where love can be expressed. Past and future become useful references rather than prisons, stories that inform but do not confine. In meditation, this understanding deepens. The striving for special states, the judgment of good versus bad experiences, the subtle violence of trying to improve yourself, all begin to dissolve in the recognition that what you truly are is already present, already perfect, already complete. Meditation becomes not an effort to get somewhere else, but a relaxation into what is already here. Sacred indifference toward the content of experience allows the experiencer to recognize itself as the unchanging awareness in which all content appears. This is where the spiritual path reveals its ultimate paradox. The more completely you accept what is, the more naturally what is begins to transform. The more deeply you rest in the present moment, the more spontaneously creative action arises. The more thoroughly you embrace your humanity, the more clearly your divinity shines through. Sacred indifference toward spiritual attainment becomes the very condition in which genuine realization flowers. The mystics spoke of this as the dark night of the soul, not because it is dark, but because it is so bright that the ego's vision cannot comprehend it. It appears as indifference only from the perspective of the small self that has built its entire identity around getting, achieving, becoming. From the perspective of the larger self, it is revealed as the ultimate care, a love so vast that it embraces all possibilities, all outcomes, all expressions of the infinite playing in finite form. As you cultivate this sacred indifference, you may notice that your relationship with success and failure begins to equalize. Both become interesting experiences rather than ultimate verdicts on your worth. Victory teaches humility, defeat teaches resilience, and both are recognized as temporary weather patterns in the vast sky of being. The ego's desperate attachment to being right, looking good, Staying safe gradually dissolves in the recognition that what you truly are cannot be threatened by any external circumstance. This does not mean becoming passive or disengaged. The sage acts, but from a different source. Action arises not from ego's compulsion, but from love's spontaneous movement. Like water flowing naturally downhill, finding the path of least resistance while carving the most beautiful canyons, your actions begin to carry the effortless power that comes from alignment with what is. In sacred indifference, you discover that the universe has been supporting you all along, not in the way the ego wanted to be supported, with guaranteed outcomes and protected preferences, but in the deeper way of providing exactly what is needed for the soul's evolution in each moment. Every experience, pleasant or painful, becomes recognition as a perfect teacher, a precise invitation to grow in wisdom and compassion. This is the alchemy of sacred indifference. It transmutes the lead of human experience into the gold of divine understanding, not by changing what happens, but by transforming your relationship to what happens. Not by eliminating preferences, but by holding preferences lightly, not by ceasing to care, but by caring from such depth that the caring itself becomes a form of worship, a celebration of the mystery that expresses itself through the 10,000 things while remaining forever untouchable by any of them. As this chapter of your journey deepens, you begin to understand that sacred indifference is not something you do, but something you are. It is not a practice you add to your spiritual resume, but the natural fragrance of a soul that has remembered its true nature. Like the fragrance of a flower that cannot help but scent the air, sacred indifference emanates naturally from those who have come to rest in the unshakable foundation of their own being. The Buddha's final words were said to be, "All things pass away. Work out your salvation with diligence." This is the perfect expression of sacred indifference, complete recognition of impermanence coupled with complete commitment to awakening, knowing that all forms arise and dissolve, yet dedicating yourself fully to the pathless path of realizing what never changes, caring deeply about the work of consciousness while holding lightly to any particular result of that work. In this space of sacred indifference, you become a blessing to the world simply by being authentically yourself. Your presence carries a quality of peace that others can feel but cannot name. Your actions, arising from stillness rather than agitation, carry a precision and grace that serves without effort. Your love, freed from the need to possess or control, becomes a gift that asks nothing in return while giving everything. This is the gift of sacred indifference to the world. Beings who can engage fully without being consumed by their engagement, who can care deeply without being destroyed by their caring, who can love completely while remaining free. In a world driven by anxiety and attachment, such beings become lighthouses of possibility, demonstrations of what becomes available when the soul learns to hold its humanness within the vast embrace of its divinity. Deep in the mythic landscape of the psyche, there sits a king upon a throne that was never truly his. This monarch, the ego in all its assumed majesty, has ruled your inner kingdom with the iron fist of one who knows secretly that his reign is illegitimate. He has convinced himself and his subjects that he is the rightful sovereign of consciousness, the center around which all of existence must revolve. But the time has come for this king to die, and with his death, a renewal so profound that the very ground of being trembles with anticipation. This is not the death of personality, not the annihilation of the individual self that thinks and chooses and navigates the world. No, this is something far more surgical, far more sacred. It is the death of an illusion so fundamental, so deeply embedded in the architecture of human experience that most never question its authority. The ego king must die so that the true ruler, The self, vast and mysterious and aligned with the deeper currents of existence, can take its rightful place on the throne of consciousness. The mythic imagination has always known this story. In every culture, in every sacred tradition, we find tales of the king who must die for the land to be renewed. The fisher king of Celtic legend, wounded and impotent, whose barren kingdom reflects his inner condition. The corn king of ancient fertility rites, whose sacrifice ensures the return of spring. The divine king of Egypt, who dies symbolically each sunset, only to be reborn with each dawn. These are not merely stories, but maps of consciousness, guidebooks for the soul's most essential transformation. You have lived under this ego king's rule for so long that his tyranny has become invisible, like water to a fish, or air to a bird. His voice has become so familiar that you mistake it for your own authentic voice, his desires for your genuine longings, his fears for necessary cautions. But look closely at the quality of this ruler's governance, and you begin to see the signs of a kingdom in decline, a sovereignty built upon foundations of sand. The ego king rules through fear. Every decision in his realm is colored by the anxiety of potential loss, the dread of not being enough, the terror of not having enough, the panic of not doing enough. He sits upon his throne, scanning the horizon for threats, real or imagined, maintaining elaborate defense systems against the possibility of his own irrelevance. His kingdom is a fortress, and like all fortresses, it is as much a prison as a protection. This monarch's deepest fear is not death, but insignificance, the possibility that he might not be the center of the universe, that existence might continue quite well without his anxious management. So he creates endless projects to prove his importance, builds monuments to his achievements, wages wars against anything that challenges his supremacy. He interprets everything personally, takes credit for successes and blame for failures, believes that the weight of the world rests upon his shoulders. But beneath the grandiose facades and defensive strategies, the ego king is profoundly lonely. Cut off from the deeper sources of wisdom and strength, he knows only the exhausting work of trying to control what cannot be controlled. He has forgotten his connection to the larger rhythms of existence, the greater intelligence that moves the stars and grows the flowers and knows how to heal a wound without conscious intervention. The time of his death announces itself through unmistakable signs. The old strategies begin to fail with increasing frequency. The castle walls that once seemed impregnable start to show cracks. The subjects of the inner kingdom, thoughts, emotions, desires, fears, begin to rebel against his authoritarian rule. What once brought satisfaction now feels empty. What once provided security now feels confining. What once seemed like strength now reveals itself as brittle defensiveness. This crisis often arrives disguised as external circumstances, the career that suddenly loses its meaning, the relationship that exposes the ego's impossible demands, the illness that humbles the body's assumed invincibility, the loss that shatters carefully constructed identities. But the wise soul recognizes these as invitations to an inner reckoning, opportunities for the ego king to face the futility of his reign and prepare for the transformation that can only come through symbolic death. The death throes of the ego king are rarely peaceful. Like any tyrant facing the loss of power, he fights with increasing desperation. The mind becomes a battlefield of conflicting voices, one moment proclaiming grandiose plans for regaining control, the next falling into abyssal despair at the impossibility of the situation. He bargains and threatens, promises and pleads, employs every strategy in his considerable arsenal to maintain his grip on the throne. This is the dark night of the ego, and it must be honored as a sacred passage. The urge to medicate this discomfort, to spiritual bypass the necessary dissolution, to prematurely declare victory over the ego's resistance. All of these are forms of avoiding the complete transformation that is being offered. The Ego King's death cannot be forced or rushed or bypassed. It must be allowed to unfold in its own timing, with all the messiness and terror and confusion that such profound change entails. In the deepest moments of this dissolution, there comes a recognition that splits the sky of consciousness like lightning. The ego realizes with a shock that reverberates through every cell of being that it has never been in control. Not really, not ever. The breath breathes itself. The heart beats itself. The body heals itself. The universe expands itself. The flowers bloom themselves. All the ego's frantic activity, all its elaborate schemes and careful plans, have been nothing more than foam on the surface of an ocean whose depths it has never touched. This recognition could be devastating if it remained at the level of personal failure. But something else is revealed in this moment of complete surrender, the presence of a deeper intelligence, a vaster self that has been there all along, waiting patiently for the ego to exhaust itself and finally ask for help. This is not a foreign force or external deity, but the true nature of what you have always been, consciousness itself, aware and awake and inherently wise beyond any mental construction. The death of the Ego King is not his annihilation, but his transformation from tyrant to servant. The personality remains, with all its quirks and preferences and learned patterns, but its relationship to the deeper self undergoes a fundamental reorientation. Where once the ego commanded, now it listens. Where once it demanded center stage, now it takes its proper place as one voice in a much larger choir. Where once it claimed absolute authority, now it recognizes its true function as translator and implementer of a wisdom that flows from beyond its comprehension. This shift often happens not with dramatic fanfare, but with the quiet naturalness of sunrise. One day you wake up and realize that the internal struggle has simply ended, not through victory or defeat, but through a kind of gentle resolution that dissolves the very basis of the conflict. The Ego King is dead, but you are more alive than ever. The tyrant has fallen, but the kingdom has not collapsed. It has been liberated. In the space left by the ego's desperate clutching, a new kind of leadership emerges. This is not the leadership of dominance, but of service, not the authority of force, but of natural alignment with what wants to emerge. Decisions begin to arise not from anxiety about outcomes, but from a deeper listening to what serves the highest good. Action flows not from compulsive doing, but from inspired response to the moment's genuine requirements. This new sovereignty has the quality of water, yielding yet irresistible, soft yet capable of carving the hardest stone. It leads by following the natural flow of life, guides by getting out of the way, achieves by allowing rather than forcing. This is the leadership of the sage, the authority of one who has died to personal ambition and been reborn into cosmic service. The mythic dimension of this transformation reveals itself in the recognition that you are participating in a drama as old as consciousness itself. Every hero's journey, every initiation rite, every spiritual tradition points toward this essential passage from ego identification to self-realization. You are not just healing your personal psychology, but participating in the evolution of consciousness itself, becoming a living bridge between the human and the divine. In relationships, the death of the Ego King creates space for authentic intimacy. No longer do you need others to confirm your specialness or protect your fragility. No longer do you relate from the desperate hunger of incompleteness, seeking completion in another. Instead, relationship becomes a celebration of wholeness meeting wholeness, a dance of two sovereign beings who choose to share their fullness rather than fill their emptiness. The Ego King's death also transforms your relationship with time, no longer driven by the frantic urgency of proving yourself before it's too late. You begin to inhabit time rather than be consumed by it. Past becomes a treasury of lessons rather than a burden of regrets. Future becomes a field of possibilities rather than an anxiety-provoking unknown. Present becomes the only place where life actually exists, the eternal now where all action and choice and love occur. Work and creativity undergo their own transformation. The desperate striving for success, recognition, security, all the ego's motivations that turn creation into transaction, give way to a natural outflow of what wants to be expressed through this unique configuration of consciousness. You become a channel rather than a creator, an instrument through which life plays its infinite symphony rather than a composer trying to force your small song onto the cosmic orchestra. This is not a loss of individuality, but its ultimate fulfillment. The Ego King's tyranny was actually a prison that prevented your true uniqueness from emerging. His constant comparison with others, his need to be special in opposition to rather than in harmony with the whole, his fear of authenticity that might be rejected, all of this kept your genuine nature locked away. With his death comes the liberation to be fully, completely, unapologetically yourself, not in defiance of the whole, but as the whole's unique expression. The paradox reveals itself. The more completely the ego dies, the more vibrantly individual you become. But this individuality is no longer separate from the collective, no longer in competition with other expressions of life. You become like a unique instrument in an orchestra, each note distinct yet contributing to a greater harmony, each voice essential to the cosmic symphony. The physical body itself undergoes transformation in this process. Released from the chronic tension of the ego's defensive postures, it begins to move with a new grace, a natural dignity that comes from within rather than being imposed from without. Illness and healing, aging and vitality, pleasure and pain, all are met with the same accepting awareness that recognizes the body as a temporary temple, housing an eternal presence. In the realm of thought, the Ego King's death brings profound liberation. No longer are you identified with the endless stream of mental chatter, the compulsive thinking that the ego mistakes for intelligence. Thoughts arise and dissolve in the spaciousness of awareness like clouds moving through an empty sky. You learn to use the mind rather than be used by it, to think when thinking is useful, and rest in thoughtless presence when mental activity serves no purpose. This transformation extends to the emotional realm as well. Emotions, which the Ego King treated as threats to be controlled or problems to be solved, reveal themselves as messengers from the deeper intelligence of the body-mind. Fear becomes a signal to pay attention. Anger becomes energy for necessary action. Sadness becomes an opening of the heart to life's inevitable losses. Joy becomes the natural expression of alignment with what is. The death of the Ego King is often accompanied by a period of what mystics call the void, a space of not knowing that can feel like profound emptiness. This is the tomb phase of the resurrection process, the necessary darkness before the new dawn. Here, in this space between what was and what will be, the soul learns to rest in mystery, to be comfortable with uncertainty, to trust in the intelligence of the process, even when its direction is unclear. From this void, slowly and naturally, a new form of selfhood begins to emerge. Not the fabricated identity of the ego, built from external achievements and others' opinions, but the authentic self that has always been present beneath the social conditioning and psychological programming. This self has the quality of space itself, vast enough to contain all experiences while being defined by none of them. The new ruler that takes the throne is not a king at all, but something far more mysterious, a presence that governs without governing, leads without pushing, creates without forcing. This is the self that Jung wrote of, the archetype of wholeness that represents not what we become, but what we have always been beneath the layers of identification and confusion. With this new sovereignty comes a different relationship to power itself. No longer is power sought as a means of control or security. Instead, power is recognized as the natural capacity to respond authentically to what life presents, the ability to act from alignment rather than reaction, the strength that comes from surrender to what is greater than personal will. The Ego King's death is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process, a daily choice to step aside from the small self's demands and allow the larger intelligence to move through you. Each moment offers the opportunity to die a little more to the illusion of separate selfhood and be reborn into the reality of interconnected being. Each breath becomes a practice of letting go, each heartbeat a reminder of the life that lives you rather than being lived by you. In service, the transformed being finds their true calling, not service born from guilt or obligation, not the ego's strategy for earning love or avoiding judgment, but the natural overflow of a heart that has recognized its unity with all life. Service becomes as natural as breathing, as spontaneous as the sun giving light or the tree giving oxygen. It is not something you do, but something you are, a unique expression of the universal impulse toward healing, growth, and awakening. The death of the Ego King completes itself in the recognition that there was never really a king to die. The whole drama of his reign, his struggle, and his death has been consciousness, exploring itself through the story of separation and return. The ego was never your enemy but your teacher, never your master but your guide through the labyrinth of identification toward the recognition of your true nature. In the end, what dies is not the ego but the ego's claim to ultimate authority. What dies is not the personality but the personality's identification as the totality of who you are. What dies is not the individual but the illusion of the individual as separate from the whole. And in this death, what is born is not something new, but the recognition of what has always been. Consciousness itself, playing at being you, dreaming itself into form only to awaken to its formless essence. The kingdom is renewed, the wasteland blooms, the waters flow again, and you, no longer king but no longer subject, no longer separate but no longer lost in merger, no longer someone seeking awakening but awakening itself, recognizing its own nature, you rest in the sovereignty that was never yours to claim but has always been yours to embody. In the secret chambers of the soul's deepest knowing, where all seeking comes to rest and all questions dissolve into direct recognition, there lies hidden the treasure that alchemists have sought for millennia. Not in retorts and crucibles, not in the marriage of mercury and sulfur, not in the elaborate operations of laboratory science, but here, in the very core of what you have always been, rests the philosopher's stone, that legendary substance capable of transmuting base metals into gold. The great work nears its completion, though you are only now beginning to understand that it was complete before it ever began. The opus contra naturam, the work against nature that is simultaneously the most natural thing in existence, reveals its ultimate secret. You are both the laboratory and the experiment, both the alchemist and the prima materia, both the seeker and the sought. The stone you have been searching for in 1,000 places has been the very ground of your searching all along. This recognition does not arrive with fanfare or supernatural phenomena. It comes with the quiet simplicity of dawn breaking over familiar landscape, illuminating what was always there but hidden by the darkness of not knowing. like a person who suddenly realizes they have been carrying their glasses on their head while frantically searching for them. There is both profound relief and gentle laughter at the cosmic joke of seeking what was never lost. The philosopher's stone within is not a thing but a recognition, not an attainment but a remembering, not a becoming but a return to what has always been true. It is the acknowledgement of your own divine nature, not as grandiose inflation of the ego's spiritual ambitions, but as the humble recognition of the sacred ground of being that underlies all existence. This is the gold that cannot be stolen, the treasure that cannot be lost, the incorruptible essence that remains untouched by the vicissitudes of time and circumstance. In the language of the ancient alchemists, this stone possesses three miraculous properties. It heals all diseases, it prolongs life indefinitely, and it transmutes base metals into gold. But these are not physical promises, but symbolic truths about the transformation of consciousness. The stone within heals the fundamental disease of separation, the cosmic loneliness that drives all seeking and suffering. It grants eternal life not to the body, but to that which was never born and therefore can never die. And it transmutes the base metal of ordinary experience into the gold of sacred awareness, revealing the divine nature that shines through every moment when seen with clear eyes. The healing that comes with this recognition is unlike any cure the ego could imagine. It does not eliminate pain or prevent loss or guarantee that life will conform to personal preferences. Instead, it heals the split between what is and what should be, between the human and the divine, between the seeker and the sought. In finding the stone within, you discover that what you thought was broken was never actually broken. What you thought was missing was never actually absent. What you thought was wrong with you was never anything more than a case of mistaken identity. This healing reaches backward through time, touching every wound you have carried, every moment of feeling insufficient or unloved or lost, not by changing the past, but by revealing the presence that was there all along, the untouchable awareness that witnessed every experience without being diminished by any of it. The philosopher's stone within is like a retroactive blessing, sanctifying everything you have been through as a necessary part of the journey toward this recognition. The gift of eternal life that the stone bestows is perhaps its most mysterious property, for this is not the ego's desperate desire to extend personal existence indefinitely, but the recognition of that which exists beyond the boundaries of birth and death. In finding the stone within, you discover your true nature as consciousness itself, that which was never born into this world, because it is the very ground in which all worlds appear, that which will never die because it is the deathless background against which all change occurs. This recognition transforms your relationship with mortality in the most profound way. Death reveals itself not as an ending, but as a transition, not as an annihilation, but as a changing of clothes, not as a tragedy, but as the natural completion of one expression of the eternal in time. The fear of death that drives so much of human anxiety and achievement dissolves in the direct knowing of your imperishable nature. You realize that what you truly are has never been at risk, could never be at risk, is in fact the very fabric of existence itself. But perhaps the most practical and immediately transformative property of the philosopher's stone within is its power of transmutation, the ability to transform the ordinary experiences of daily life into expressions of the sacred. This is not about changing external circumstances, but about recognizing the gold that is already present in every moment, waiting to be discovered beneath the surface appearance of the mundane. The alchemist's lead becomes the symbol for all those experiences that seem heavy, dense, problematic, the difficult emotions, the challenging relationships, the mundane tasks, the physical discomforts, the psychological struggles. The stone within does not eliminate these experiences, but reveals their hidden nature as disguised forms of the divine, opportunities for consciousness to know itself in ever new ways. Perfect teachers offering precisely the lessons needed for continued awakening. Anger, met with the philosopher's stone of awareness, transmutes into the gold of passionate engagement with life. Fear, touched by this inner alchemy, becomes the gold of appropriate caution and wise discernment. Sadness transforms into the gold of an open heart that can feel the poignancy of impermanence. Even boredom reveals its golden nature as spacious presence temporarily forgetting its own vastness. This transmutation extends to relationships, where the lead of conflict and misunderstanding becomes the gold of deeper intimacy and compassion. Every argument becomes an opportunity to practice unconditional love. Every betrayal becomes a chance to discover forgiveness. Every loss becomes an opening to appreciate what remains. The philosopher's stone within reveals that there are no ordinary moments, no insignificant encounters, no wasted experiences, only consciousness exploring itself through the endless variations of human experience. In work and creative expression, this inner alchemy transforms the base metal of duty and obligation into the gold of joyful service. Even the most mundane tasks become opportunities for presence, for bringing consciousness to unconscious activities, for offering the gift of awareness to whatever requires attention. The philosopher's stone within makes every action a meditation, every encounter a sacrament, every moment a doorway to the sacred. The recognition of this inner treasure brings with it a profound shift in what Jung called the attitude of consciousness. No longer are you primarily oriented toward getting something from life. Pleasure, security, recognition, love, understanding. Instead, life becomes an opportunity to give, to offer the gift of awakened presence to whatever appears. This shift from taking to giving, from grasping to blessing, from seeking to serving, marks the true maturation of the soul. But this is not the giving born from duty or obligation or the ego's need to be good. This is the spontaneous overflow of a cup that has recognized its own eternal fullness. Like a spring that bubbles up from underground sources, the giving that flows from one who has found the philosopher's stone within is natural, effortless, inexhaustible. It gives not from abundance achieved, but from abundance recognized, not from wealth accumulated, but from richness revealed. The stone within also bestows what the alchemists called the divine sight, the ability to perceive the sacred dimension of ordinary reality. This is not a supernatural vision, but a natural recognition, not an addition to normal perception, but a subtraction of the veils that usually obscure it. With this sight, every face becomes a mask worn by the divine, every landscape a sacred geography, every sound a note in the cosmic symphony, every moment a fresh creation of the eternal now. This transformed perception reveals the world as the alchemists truly saw it, not as dead matter governed by mechanical laws, but as a living embodiment of consciousness, a love letter written by the divine to itself, a work of art so magnificent that most never notice they are living inside a masterpiece. The philosopher's stone within is the capacity to read this letter, to see this art, to participate consciously in this divine play. In the depths of meditation, this recognition deepens into what can only be called the direct taste of your own essence, not a spiritual experience that comes and goes, but the recognition of what remains constant through all experiences. Not a state to be attained, but the very awareness in which all states arise and dissolve. The philosopher's stone within reveals itself as pure being, awareness, bliss, the Satchitananda of the Vedantic tradition, the Dharmakaya of Buddhist understanding, the pleroma of Christian mysticism. Yet this recognition is not the end of the journey, but its beginning. For once you have found the philosopher's stone within, the real work begins. The work of living from this recognition, of embodying this understanding, of allowing this inner gold to transmute every aspect of your human experience. This is perhaps the most challenging part of the great work, for it requires the integration of the highest spiritual realization with the most ordinary human activities. The stone within does not exempt you from the human condition, but reveals its divine nature. You still experience emotions, face challenges, make mistakes, encounter loss, but all of these experiences are held within the vast space of awakened awareness, transformed by their context into opportunities for deeper realization, clearer expression, more complete embodiment of your essential nature. This embodiment often requires a kind of dying before dying, the dissolution of all the subtle ways the ego tries to claim ownership of this recognition, to make it special, to use it as spiritual ammunition in the ongoing war against life as it is. The philosopher's stone within belongs to no one and everyone, is the birthright of every conscious being, the ultimate democracy of awakened awareness that plays no favorites and makes no exceptions. The integration of this recognition into daily life reveals what the tantric traditions understood, that the sacred and the mundane are not separate realms, but different perspectives on the same reality. The philosopher's stone within sanctifies everything it touches, which is to say, everything. For there is nothing outside the scope of consciousness, nothing beyond the reach of awareness, nothing that exists independently of the divine ground in which all existence appears. In relationship with others, this integration expresses itself as what could be called ordinary holiness, the simple recognition of the same essential nature in every being encountered. Not the projected perfection that ignores human flaws and limitations, but the deeper recognition of the perfect essence that expresses itself through imperfect forms. The philosopher's stone within allows you to see past the personality to the presence, past the behavior to the being, past the temporal expression to the eternal essence. This recognition transforms service from obligation into celebration. Every act of kindness becomes a recognition of your own nature reflected in another. Every gesture of support becomes a way of honoring the divine that appears as both the giver and the receiver. Every moment of genuine helping becomes a form of worship, an offering of the gold of consciousness to consciousness itself appearing as the one in need. The philosopher's stone within also reveals the ultimate purpose of all human suffering, not as punishment or mistake or cosmic accident, but as the pressure that transforms coal into diamonds, the fire that purifies gold, the darkness that makes the dawn precious. Every challenge becomes a teacher, every difficulty a doorway, every loss an invitation to discover what cannot be lost. The stone within recontextualizes everything, revealing the perfect intelligence that orchestrates even the most seemingly random events in service of awakening. As this recognition stabilizes, there comes a quality of being that could be called unbreakable. Not because nothing can touch you. Indeed, you may become more sensitive, more responsive, more finely tuned to the subtleties of existence, but unbreakable in the sense that what you truly are remains untouched by any experience, unlimited by any circumstance, undamaged by any loss. This is the imperishable quality of the philosopher's stone within, the indestructible diamond of awareness that cuts through every illusion while itself remaining perfectly clear. The alchemical texts speak of the stone as simultaneously the most common and the most precious substance, found everywhere yet recognized by few. This perfectly describes the nature of your own essential awareness, as present and available as your next breath, yet overlooked by most in their search for more exotic forms of fulfillment. The philosopher's stone within is hiding in plain sight, disguised as the ordinary consciousness that is reading these words, thinking these thoughts, feeling these feelings right now. The completion of the great work is marked not by the acquisition of special powers or supernatural abilities, but by the profound ordinariness of being fully human while knowing yourself as divine. The philosopher's stone within does not elevate you above the human condition, but reveals the human condition as a temporary costume worn by eternal consciousness. You remain completely human while knowing yourself as infinitely more than human, fully embedded in time while recognizing yourself as timeless, entirely individual while experiencing yourself as universal. This is the final transmutation, not the transformation of who you are, but the recognition of who you have always been. The base metal of seeking dissolves into the gold of finding, only to discover that the seeker, the seeking, and the sought were never actually separate. The philosopher's stone within reveals itself as the very awareness that has been witnessing this entire journey, the unchanging background against which all change has occurred, the silent presence that has been here all along, patiently waiting for you to notice what was never absent. In this recognition, the great work completes itself, though you understand now that it was never really begun. The philosopher's stone within reveals that you are both the beginning and the end of every quest, both the question and the answer to every mystery, both the wave and the ocean, both the drop and the sea. You are the alchemist who has spent lifetimes searching for the treasure that you are, the philosopher who has finally discovered that the stone you sought was the very consciousness seeking it. And in this completion, a new cycle begins. Not the cycle of seeking, but the cycle of sharing. Not the journey toward realization, but the journey of realization through form. Not the work of becoming, but the art of being. The philosopher's stone within has been found, and now its light shines forth through every word, every action, every breath, transmuting the world not by changing it, but by revealing what it has always been, the golden dream of consciousness playing at forgetting and remembering itself through the 10,000 forms of you. There comes a moment in every profound journey when the traveler must turn their face from the sacred mountain and walk back down into the valley of human voices. You have dwelt in the cathedral of your own solitude, have touched the bedrock of your being, have discovered that beneath all the shifting sands of circumstance lies something eternal and unbreakable. The chrysalis has completed its work. The wings have dried in the darkness. Now comes the most paradoxical movement of all, the return to the very world you once needed to leave behind. But listen carefully to the quality of this returning. This is not the defeated retreat of one who could not sustain the heights, nor the reluctant descent of a hermit dragged back to society against their will. This is the sacred return of the twice-born, carrying in their very cells the memory of transformation, bearing in their eyes the light that can only be kindled in the depths of authentic solitude. You are not the same being who once fled the noise and chaos of human entanglement. You are the hero returning from the underworld, and you carry treasures that the world desperately needs. The mythic pattern reveals itself with stunning clarity now. Every great spiritual tradition speaks of this moment, the return of the transformed one to the marketplace, the descent of the enlightened being back into the realm of suffering, the emergence of the initiated from the temple into the streets, where ordinary life unfolds. Moses comes down from the mountain with tablets of law, his face so radiant it must be veiled. Buddha rises from beneath the Bodhi tree and begins to teach. Christ emerges from 40 days in the wilderness to heal the sick and comfort the afflicted. The pattern is eternal because it speaks to something fundamental in the architecture of human transformation. You, too, are part of this eternal pattern. The detachment you have cultivated was never meant to be a permanent escape from the world, but rather a sacred preparation for a deeper engagement with it. Like a deep-sea diver who must decompress slowly when returning to the surface, you are learning to carry the treasures of the depths back into the shallows where most of human life unfolds. The pressure is different here. The light is harsher. The demands are immediate and relentless. But you are no longer the fragile being who once broke under such pressures. You have been forged in the fires of solitude and tempered in the waters of self-knowledge. The first shock of re-engagement often comes as a surprise to those who have journeyed deep into detachment. You discover that the world has continued turning in your absence, that the dramas and conflicts that once seemed so urgent are still playing out with the same intensity, that people are still caught in the same patterns of attachment and suffering that you have learned to see through. There is a temptation in this moment to judge, to feel superior, to retreat back into the safety of your hard-won detachment. But this temptation is itself a test, a final examination of whether your transformation has been authentic or merely another form of spiritual bypassing. The truly transformed soul discovers something remarkable in this moment of return, that genuine detachment does not separate you from the world, but reveals your fundamental interconnection with all life. The walls you once built to protect your fragile ego have dissolved, not into a new kind of armor, but into a permeable membrane that allows you to feel the suffering of others without drowning in it, to witness the beauty of existence without grasping after it, to love without the desperate need to possess or control. This is the great paradox that Jung understood so deeply, that individuation, the process of becoming fully yourself, ultimately leads not to isolation but to a profound capacity for authentic relationship. The ego that has been properly dethroned does not disappear but takes its rightful place as a servant of something larger. The persona that has been examined and refined becomes not a mask, but a skillful means of engaging with different situations and people. The shadow that has been integrated no longer projects its darkness onto others, but illuminates the shared humanity that connects all beings. As you begin to re-engage with relationships, you discover that everything has changed because you have changed. The old patterns of reactivity no longer have the same hold over you. The buttons that others once pushed so easily seem to have been rewired or removed entirely. Where you once met provocation with defensiveness, you now find space for curiosity. Where you once responded to criticism with counterattack, you now discover an ability to listen for the grain of truth even in the harshest words. Where you once sought validation and approval, you now offer presence and authentic connection. But do not mistake this transformation for a kind of spiritual anesthesia, as if the journey through detachment has numbed you to the full spectrum of human experience. On the contrary, your capacity to feel has been refined and deepened. Like a musician whose ear has been trained to detect subtle harmonies and dissonances that others miss, you now experience emotions with a clarity and precision that can be almost overwhelming. The difference is that you no longer identify completely with these emotions, no longer mistake them for your essential self. They arise and pass away like weather patterns across the vast sky of your awareness. This newfound emotional fluidity allows for a quality of relationship that was impossible before your journey. You can be fully present with another person's pain without trying to fix it or make it go away. You can witness their joy without feeling diminished by it. You can offer support without attachment to the outcome, love without the desperate need to be loved in return. This is not indifference masquerading as wisdom, but the truest form of compassion, love that is free from the contamination of personal agenda. The world begins to reveal itself as a vast teaching. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to practice the principles you have learned in solitude. The difficult colleague who once triggered your anger now serves as a mirror for any remaining unintegrated aspects of your shadow. The friend whose happiness once stirred your envy now reflects back your own capacity for generous celebration. The stranger on the street whose suffering once overwhelmed your sensitive system now calls forth your natural compassion without drowning you in vicarious trauma. You begin to understand that the detachment you cultivated was not meant to be a permanent state, but a skill, a capacity that can be consciously employed when circumstances require it. Like a skilled craftsperson who knows when to use which tool, you learn to engage and withdraw, to open and close, to connect and detach, as wisdom dictates. This is not the reactive swinging between extremes that characterized your pre-transformation life, but the conscious navigation of a soul that has learned to dance with the paradoxes of human existence. In your professional life, if you have one, colleagues begin to notice something different about your presence. You are still competent, still engaged, still willing to work hard and contribute meaningfully. But there is a quality of unflappability about you that was not there before. Deadlines still matter, but they do not create the same frantic urgency. Criticism still stings, but it does not shatter your self-worth. Success still brings pleasure, but it does not inflate your ego beyond recognition. You have become what the Buddhists call like space, vast enough to accommodate whatever arises without being disturbed by it. Your family relationships undergo perhaps the most profound transformation. The roles and patterns that were established over years or decades begin to shift as you stop participating in the old dramas with the same unconscious reactivity. Your mother's criticism, your father's disappointment, your siblings' rivalry, all of these familiar triggers encounter a different response in you. Not the cold withdrawal of someone who has simply shut down, but the warm presence of someone who has learned to love without conditions, to remain connected without becoming entangled. This shift often disturbs the family system initially. Your relatives may sense that something fundamental has changed, but be unable to articulate what it is. They may try to pull you back into the old patterns, to provoke the familiar reactions that once kept the system in balance. Your refusal to play the old roles, not through rejection but through transformation, forces everyone to examine their own patterns and assumptions. Some will be inspired by your example and begin their own journey of growth. Others may resist the change and eventually distance themselves from you. Both responses are part of the natural unfolding of authentic transformation. In intimate romantic relationship, if such a bond exists in your life, the changes are perhaps most profound of all. The desperate need for validation, the jealous possessiveness, the fear of abandonment, the compulsive desire to merge completely with another. These patterns of attachment that once drove your romantic life begin to dissolve. In their place emerges something far more beautiful, the capacity to love another person fully, while allowing them the freedom to be exactly who they are. This does not mean that you become emotionally distant or uninvested in the relationship. Rather, you discover that true intimacy is only possible when two complete individuals choose to share their wholeness with each other, rather than two incomplete halves trying to form a single identity. You can be fully present with your partner's growth without trying to control it, fully supportive of their dreams without needing them to validate your own, fully committed to the relationship without losing yourself in it. The sexual dimension of intimate relationship also transforms in ways that may surprise you. The compulsive quality that once drove your physical desires, the desperate need to possess, to prove, to escape, gives way to something far more profound. Physical intimacy becomes a form of sacred communication, a wordless dialogue between two souls who have learned to be present with mystery. The orgasmic release that once provided temporary escape from the ego's prison now becomes a doorway into ever deeper communion with the divine nature of existence itself. But perhaps most significantly, you discover that your capacity for solitude has not been diminished by your return to relationship. It has been refined. You can now be alone within togetherness, maintain your center even in the midst of intense emotional intimacy. The detachment you cultivated is revealed to have been not a withdrawal from love, but a preparation for loving more fully, more freely, more authentically than ever before. Your relationship with money and material possessions also undergoes subtle but significant changes. The compulsive accumulation that once promised security, the status symbols that once provided identity, the fear of not having enough that once drove so many decisions, all of these attachments begin to loosen their grip. This does not mean you become financially irresponsible or indifferent to material comfort. Rather, you develop what might be called skillful materialism, the ability to engage with the material world without being enslaved by it, to enjoy abundance without being attached to it, to face scarcity without being destroyed by it. You may find yourself drawn to work that has more meaning, even if it offers less conventional success. The career path that once seemed so important may reveal itself to have been driven more by external expectations than authentic calling. Or you may discover that the same work you were doing before can now be approached with a completely different spirit, transformed from mere job into conscious service. The news of the world, the political upheavals, the environmental crises, the social injustices that once either overwhelmed you with despair or prompted frantic activism now evoke a different response. You still care deeply, perhaps more deeply than before, but your caring is no longer contaminated by personal reactivity. You can witness the suffering of the world without being paralyzed by it, can work for positive change without attachment to specific outcomes, can maintain hope without naive optimism, can acknowledge darkness without falling into despair. This balanced engagement with the larger world is perhaps one of the most valuable gifts that the transformed soul brings to collective human consciousness. In a time when so many people oscillate between numbed indifference and frantic reactivity, between cynical withdrawal and manic activism, you offer a third way, conscious engagement that is both passionate and detached, both deeply caring and ultimately peaceful. Your very presence begins to affect others in ways you may not even notice. People seem calmer around you. Conflicts that once escalated in your presence now somehow find resolution. Your capacity to remain centered in chaos gives others permission to find their own center. Your refusal to be drawn into drama starves the dramas of the energy they need to perpetuate themselves. Without preaching or teaching, without even trying to influence anyone, you become a living example of what is possible when a human being learns to embody both engagement and detachment. The children you encounter, whether your own or others, seem particularly sensitive to this transformed quality in you. They respond to your presence with a kind of recognition, as if they sense in you something that reminds them of their own essential nature before it became covered over by conditioning. Your ability to be fully present with them without needing to control or fix them allows their natural wisdom to emerge. Your own inner child, long buried under layers of adaptation and performance, begins to resurface, not as regression but as integration, not as childishness but as genuine playfulness and wonder. As days turn into weeks and weeks into months of this re-engagement, with the world, you begin to notice that the boundary between your inner work and your outer work has dissolved. Every interaction becomes a form of spiritual practice. Every challenge becomes an opportunity for deeper integration. Every relationship becomes a mirror for continued growth. The distinction between being alone and being with others, between meditation and action, between spiritual life and ordinary life, begins to seem artificial and arbitrary. You understand now that the detachment you cultivated was never meant to separate you from life, but to prepare you to engage with life from your deepest authenticity. Like a tree that must sink its roots deep into the darkness of the earth in order to reach toward the light, you had to journey into the depths of solitude in order to emerge capable of genuine connection. The unbreakable quality you discovered in the depths is not armor that protects you from the world, but the very foundation that allows you to dance fearlessly with whatever arises. The return to the world reveals itself to be not the end of your transformation, but its true beginning. Every day brings new opportunities to embody the wisdom you have gained, to live from the unshakable center you have discovered, to love from the overflow of wholeness rather than the desperation of emptiness. You are no longer seeking completion through external means because you have touched the completeness that was always already present within you. And yet, paradoxically, this very completeness makes you more open to growth, more willing to be surprised, more capable of genuine humility. The ego that has been properly humbled is no longer driven to prove itself and is therefore free to learn from every encounter. The self that has been recognized as already whole is paradoxically more capable of genuine transformation because it is not grasping after transformation as a means of escape from inadequacy. The return to the world, you discover, is not really a return at all, but a recognition that you never actually left. The world that seemed so separate from your inner sanctuary reveals itself to have been the training ground all along, the very laboratory in which consciousness comes to know itself. The detachment that seemed to pull you away from life reveals itself to have been life's own deepest current, carrying you home to yourself. Standing now at the threshold between solitude and society, between the inner world and the outer world, you understand that this threshold itself is your true dwelling place, not fully withdrawn, not completely engaged, but poised in the dynamic balance between the two. This is the natural habitat of the awakened soul. From this place of conscious equilibrium, you are ready to offer your gifts to a world that desperately needs what you have learned in the depths of your own becoming. The twice-born soul walks differently in the world than the once-born. There is a quality of presence, a depth of authenticity, a radiance of being that cannot be faked or imitated. This is not a role you are playing or a persona you have adopted, but the natural expression of consciousness that has learned to rest in its own essential nature. The world recognizes this quality, even when it cannot name it, and is both challenged and comforted by its presence. You have returned to the world, but you have brought the world with you into the sacred space of your own awakened heart. The boundary between inner and outer, between self and other, between the spiritual and the mundane, dissolves in the fire of this recognition. What remains is the simple, extraordinary presence of a human being who has learned to be fully human, and in that full humanity has discovered something that transcends humanity altogether. This is your gift to the world. Not the message you carry, but the being that you have become. Not the words you speak, but the silence from which they arise. Not the actions you take, but the consciousness that infuses them. In learning to be unbreakable, you have become the very medicine that a broken world needs. In learning to detach, you have discovered the secret of true connection. In returning to the world, you bring the world home to itself. In the depths of your transformation, a profound recognition begins to dawn, a truth so paradoxical and luminous that it reshapes everything you thought you understood about purpose, service, and the meaning of your own suffering. The wounds that once felt like cruel accidents, the betrayals that seemed to serve no purpose, the losses that appeared to diminish you, all of these experiences reveal themselves now as the very instruments of your deepest calling. You are becoming what the ancient wisdom traditions have always recognized as the most powerful force for healing in the world. The wounded healer, the one who transforms personal anguish into universal medicine. This is not a role you choose so much as a destiny you recognize. Like a key finally finding the lock it was shaped to open, you begin to understand that every fracture in your heart was precisely calibrated to create the channels through which healing light can flow into the world. The Greek myth of Chiron speaks to this eternal pattern, the centaur wounded by an incurable arrow who becomes the greatest healer and teacher of his age, not despite his wound, but because of it. The wound that cannot be healed in oneself becomes the source of healing for countless others. But let us be precise about what this means, for the path of the wounded healer is treacherous territory, littered with the wreckage of those who confused their neurosis with their calling, their unprocessed trauma with their spiritual mission. The true wounded healer is not one who wallows in their wounds or uses their suffering as a badge of superiority. The authentic wounded healer is one who has done the difficult work of transforming their personal anguish into transpersonal wisdom, their private hell into a bridge that others can cross toward their own liberation. The alchemical process that creates a wounded healer is both brutal and beautiful. It requires that you descend fully into the darkness of your own wounding, not to dwell there permanently, but to retrieve the gold that can only be found in those depths. Like the shamanic initiation in which the future healer must be psychically dismembered and reconstructed, you must allow your old identity to be completely shattered so that something infinitely more authentic can emerge from the pieces. This process of transformation through wounding follows a pattern that Jung mapped with surgical precision. First comes the initial wounding, the betrayal, the loss, the trauma that breaks open the protective shell of the ego. This wounding often feels random, cruel, meaningless. The ego's response is to try to heal quickly, to close the wound, to return to the previous state of innocence or invulnerability. But the soul, in its infinite wisdom, knows that some wounds are meant to be kept open, not as a source of endless bleeding, but as channels for a deeper circulation of life force. The second phase is the descent into the wound itself. This is the dark night of the soul, the period of disorientation and despair when everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world collapses into rubble. Here, in the depths of your own underworld, you encounter the shadow aspects of yourself that you have spent a lifetime avoiding. You meet the parts of yourself that are capable of cruelty, of selfishness, of profound weakness. But you also discover something else, the indestructible core of your being that remains luminous even in the darkest circumstances. The third phase is the recognition that your personal wound connects you to the universal human condition. Your specific suffering, which once felt so isolating and unique, reveals itself to be a particular manifestation of the suffering that defines the human experience. Your depression connects you to every soul who has ever felt the weight of existence. Your anxiety links you to all those who have trembled before uncertainty. Your grief joins you to the vast company of those who have loved and lost. Your rage aligns you with every heart that has ever burned with the fire of injustice. This recognition is simultaneously humbling and empowering. Humbling because it reveals that your suffering is not special, not unique, not evidence of your exceptional sensitivity or spiritual significance. Empowering because it shows you that your healing is not just personal, but archetypal, not just about your individual recovery, but about the redemption of a pattern that extends far beyond your particular life. The fourth phase is the cultivation of what might be called sacred scarring, the development of a relationship with your wound that neither glorifies it nor dismisses it, but honors it as a source of wisdom and connection. The scar tissue that forms over a deep wound is actually stronger than the original skin. In the same way, the psychic scar tissue that forms over your deepest wounds becomes a source of resilience and sensitivity that serves not only your own healing, but the healing of others. The wounded healer learns to navigate the delicate balance between identification and detachment with their wound. Too much identification and you become trapped in victim consciousness, forever defined by what was done to you. Too much detachment and you lose the very sensitivity that makes you effective as a healer. The middle path requires that you remain intimately connected to your wound while not being controlled by it, that you stay vulnerable to pain while not being destroyed by it. As you embark on the actual work of healing others, you discover that your effectiveness has nothing to do with your credentials, your techniques, or your theories. Your power as a healer flows from your authentic encounter with your own darkness and your willingness to meet others in theirs. The person sitting across from you, whether in a therapeutic setting, a friendship, a chance encounter on the street, senses immediately whether you are speaking from textbook knowledge or from the lived wisdom of your own transformation. This recognition creates a quality of presence that is both mysterious and unmistakable. People begin to seek you out, often without knowing exactly why. They sense in you something that gives them permission to acknowledge their own pain, to speak truths they have never voiced, to hope for healing they had given up on. Your very being becomes a kind of tuning fork that helps others find their own authentic frequency beneath the noise of their conditioning and trauma. But the path of the wounded healer is not without its dangers and temptations. There is the seductive power that comes from being needed, the intoxication of being seen as wise or special or gifted. There is the tendency to become identified with your role as healer, to lose touch with your own ongoing need for growth and healing. There is the risk of spiritual inflation, of believing that your wounds have made you superior to others rather than simply more capable of serving them. The authentic wounded healer must therefore maintain what might be called therapeutic humility, the constant remembering that you are not healing others so much as creating conditions in which they can heal themselves. You are not the source of the medicine, but its temporary vessel. The healing that flows through you originates from the same source that is seeking to heal the person before you. Your wound simply provides the channel through which this universal healing force can flow from one human heart to another. This understanding transforms the entire dynamics of the helping relationship. Instead of the traditional model of expert and patient, of knower and seeker, of healed and wounded, you create a field of mutual recognition in which both parties are simultaneously giving and receiving, teaching and learning, healing and being healed. The person seeking help carries medicine that you need, just as you carry medicine that they need. The exchange that occurs is not one-directional but circular, not hierarchical but mutual. In your work with others, you discover that your greatest tool is not your advice or your interpretations, but your capacity to be present with pain without trying to fix it, to witness suffering without being overwhelmed by it, to hold space for the full spectrum of human emotion without judgment or agenda. Your own journey through the valley of shadows has taught you that healing often requires a descent before the ascent, a falling apart before the coming together, a death before the resurrection. You learn to trust the organic intelligence of the healing process, to resist the ego's desire to control outcomes or timeline. Like a skilled midwife, you understand that your job is not to force birth, but to assist a natural process that has its own rhythm and wisdom. Some healings happen quickly in a sudden breakthrough of insight or release. Others unfold slowly over months or years, requiring patience and faith from both healer and client. Still others occur in ways that are invisible to the conscious mind, shifts in the deep structures of the psyche that only become apparent much later. Your relationship with different kinds of wounds begins to develop its own sophistication and nuance. You recognize that depression requires a different quality of presence than anxiety, that grief calls for different responses than rage, that childhood trauma creates different defensive patterns than adult betrayal. But beneath all these specific differences, you begin to sense the universal wound that underlies all particular wounds, the fundamental sense of separation from wholeness that defines the human condition. This recognition leads you into increasingly subtle dimensions of healing work. You begin to address not just the symptoms, but the existential foundations that give rise to them. You work not just with what happened to people, but with their relationship to what happened. Not just with their pain, but with their resistance to pain. Not just with their wounds, but with their identity as wounded ones. The families and communities that surround the people you work with also become part of your field of attention. You understand that individual healing cannot be separated from relational healing, that personal transformation inevitably affects the entire system in which a person is embedded. Sometimes your work involves helping people establish healthier boundaries with toxic family systems. Sometimes it involves facilitating difficult conversations that allow for mutual healing and reconciliation. Your understanding of healing expands beyond the psychological into the spiritual, the somatic, the ancestral, the collective. You begin to sense how individual wounds connect to larger patterns of cultural trauma, how personal healing contributes to the healing of historical wounds that span generations. You recognize that in helping one person transform their relationship to abandonment, you are contributing to the healing of the abandonment wound that affects countless others. In assisting someone to reclaim their authentic voice, you are participating in the liberation of all those who have been silenced. The work begins to work on you in ways you did not anticipate. Every person you serve becomes a mirror reflecting back aspects of yourself that still need attention. The client who struggles with perfectionism shows you your own remaining perfectionist tendencies. The person wrestling with control issues illuminates your own subtle attempts to control outcomes. The individual learning to trust reveals your own areas of lingering mistrust. The healing relationship becomes a two-way mirror in which both parties are continuously invited into greater wholeness. This reciprocal dimension of healing work protects you from the spiritual arrogance that can afflict those who see themselves primarily as helpers rather than fellow travelers on the path of awakening. You remain humble because you remain open to learning from every person who seeks your assistance. You stay grounded because you are continuously confronted with your own ongoing journey of growth and integration. The financial dimensions of healing work present their own spiritual challenges and opportunities. If you charge nothing, you may attract people who do not value the work or who become dependent rather than empowered. If you charge too much, you may exclude those who most need help or become trapped in providing what sells rather than what serves. The wounded healer must learn to navigate these practical considerations without losing touch with the sacred nature of the work. Many wounded healers find themselves called to work with populations that other helping professionals avoid: the homeless, the addicted, the mentally ill, the dying, the grieving, the traumatized, the marginalized. There is something in your own experience of being broken that makes you unafraid of others' brokenness, something in your journey through darkness that enables you to accompany others in theirs without being pulled under by their despair. The work with dying individuals often becomes particularly meaningful for the wounded healer. Having touched your own psychological death and rebirth, you bring a quality of presence to those facing physical death that goes beyond professional training. You understand viscerally that death is not the opposite of life, but its culmination, not a failure but a completion, not an ending but a transformation. This understanding allows you to help others face their mortality with less terror and more acceptance. Your work with children who have been wounded often reveals dimensions of healing that work with adults cannot touch. Children have not yet fully developed the sophisticated defense mechanisms that adults use to protect themselves from feeling their pain. This makes them more vulnerable but also more responsive to authentic healing presence. In working with wounded children, you often find yourself healing your own inner child, reclaiming parts of yourself that were lost or hidden in your own early wounding. The recognition that you are a wounded healer also transforms your relationship with your own ongoing pain. The physical ailments that arise, the relationship challenges that persist, the existential questions that remain unanswered. All of these are no longer just personal problems to be solved, but raw material for your continued development as a healing presence in the world. Your own struggles become your most advanced curriculum, your ongoing education in the University of Human Suffering and Transformation. This does not mean that you seek out suffering or welcome pain for its own sake. The wounded healer is not a masochist or a martyr. Rather, you develop a relationship with inevitable human difficulties that transforms them from meaningless burdens into meaningful opportunities for growth and service. Pain remains painful, but it is no longer merely personal. It becomes a doorway into deeper compassion, a bridge connecting you more authentically with the pain of others. The ultimate realization of the wounded healer is that healing and being healed are not two different activities, but two aspects of a single process. In the act of offering healing to another, you are simultaneously receiving healing yourself. In witnessing another's transformation, you are participating in your own continued evolution. In serving the healing of others, you are serving your own deepest purpose and fulfillment. This recognition dissolves the artificial boundary between helper and helped, between healer and patient, between teacher and student. What emerges is a recognition of the fundamental interconnectedness of all healing, the understanding that every act of authentic service contributes to the healing of the whole, that every gesture of compassion ripples outward in ways that extend far beyond our capacity to measure or understand. The wounded healer thus becomes a living bridge between the personal and the transpersonal, between individual suffering and universal compassion, between private healing and collective transformation. Through the alchemy of your own journey from wounding to healing, you become a medicine that the world desperately needs. Not a medicine that eliminates pain, but one that transforms it. Not a cure that erases suffering, but a blessing that reveals its hidden meaning and purpose. In embracing your identity as a wounded healer, you step into one of the most ancient and sacred roles in human culture. You join the lineage of shamans and medicine people, of wise women and compassionate bodhisattvas, of all those who have discovered that their greatest wounds can become their greatest gifts to the world. Your scars become your credentials, your brokenness becomes your wholeness, your deepest pain becomes your most profound source of healing for others. This is the ultimate paradox of the wounded healer, that in accepting and integrating your wounds, you transcend them. not by eliminating them or pretending they never existed, but by discovering their hidden purpose, their sacred function, their role in preparing you to serve something infinitely larger than your personal story of suffering and recovery. Your wounds become doorways through which love can enter the world, channels through which healing can flow, bridges across which others can walk from despair toward hope. The path of the wounded healer is not an easy one, but it is perhaps the most meaningful way to transform personal suffering into collective blessing. It asks everything of you, your pain, your healing, your continued growth, your willingness to remain vulnerable in service of others' healing. But it offers in return the deepest possible sense of purpose, the most authentic form of service, and the profound satisfaction that comes from knowing that your own journey through darkness has become a light that can guide others home to themselves. And so we arrive at the most profound recognition of all, the understanding that this journey you have traveled, this path from attachment to detachment to integration, is not a linear progression with a clear beginning and end, but an eternal spiral that curves back upon itself in ever-deepening cycles of death and rebirth. Like the ancient symbol of the Ouroboros, the serpent eternally consuming its own tail, the path of transformation reveals itself to be circular rather than straight, cyclical rather than conclusive, an endless return to the same essential questions at ever greater depths of understanding. This recognition often comes as a shock to those who have traveled far along the path of awakening. There is something in the ego's structure that craves completion, that seeks the final achievement, the ultimate enlightenment, the permanent transcendence of all human limitations. We dream of reaching a plateau of spiritual attainment from which we will never again have to struggle with doubt, never again face the darkness of our own shadow, never again feel the pull of old attachments or the sting of new wounds. But the truly mature soul discovers that such permanent transcendence is neither possible nor desirable, that the very longing for it represents a subtle form of spiritual materialism, a final attempt of the ego to establish itself as permanently superior to the human condition. The eternal return is not a failure of the spiritual path, but its most profound teaching. It reveals that consciousness does not evolve in a straight line toward some final destination, but spirals through the same essential territories again and again, each return offering an opportunity for deeper integration, greater wisdom, more refined compassion. The grief you thought you had fully processed returns in a new form, calling you to discover dimensions of loss you had not previously recognized. The anger you believed you had completely integrated surfaces again, revealing subtler layers of injustice that require your attention. The fear you assumed you had transcended emerges once more, inviting you into an even more intimate relationship with uncertainty. But this return is not mere repetition. Like the spiral path that winds around a mountain, each circuit brings you to the same cardinal directions, but at a higher elevation, with a broader perspective, with a deeper capacity to embrace paradox and complexity. The depression that returns is met not with the desperate resistance of your earlier encounters, but with a more mature acceptance that recognizes depression as one of consciousness's ways of composting old identities to make space for new growth. The relationship patterns that reemerge are engaged not with the unconscious reactivity that characterized your younger years, but with a more nuanced understanding of how intimacy serves the evolution of both partners. Jung understood this spiral nature of psychological development with remarkable clarity. His concept of enantiodromia, the tendency of psychological states to transform into their opposites, reveals that what appears to be regression is often actually a necessary preparation for a quantum leap in consciousness. The successful executive who suddenly feels called to abandon their career and become a monk is not having a midlife crisis, but responding to the soul's need for a radical rebalancing. The devoted spiritual seeker who finds themselves drawn back into worldly engagement is not abandoning their path, but integrating it into a more complete expression of their humanity. This understanding transforms your relationship with the inevitable cycles of expansion and contraction that characterize human existence. Where once you might have judged the contractive phases as failures or setbacks, you now recognize them as necessary counterbalances to the expansive phases, essential periods of integration and deepening. The season of withdrawal that follows a period of intense engagement is not a retreat from growth, but a return to the source for renewal. The doubt that arises after a breakthrough insight is not evidence of backsliding, but the psyche's way of ensuring that new understanding is thoroughly tested and integrated. The eternal return reveals itself most clearly in the realm of spiritual practice. Those who have dedicated themselves to meditation, prayer, contemplation, or other forms of inner work often discover that they cycle through the same basic stages again and again. The honeymoon period of enthusiasm and rapid progress, the plateau of routine and diminishing returns, the dark night when the practice seems empty and meaningless, the breakthrough into new depths, and then the beginning of a new cycle at a more subtle level. Each return to apparent beginnership is actually a sign of deepening maturity, an indication that consciousness is ready to explore ever more refined dimensions of the spiritual path. Your relationship with your own psychological patterns also becomes more sophisticated through this recognition of eternal return. The perfectionist tendencies that you worked so hard to overcome in your 30s return in your 50s, but now you meet them with the wisdom earned through decades of inner work. You understand that the perfectionist is not an enemy to be defeated, but a part of your psyche that carries important medicine, a commitment to excellence that simply needs to be balanced with self-compassion, a drive for improvement that must be tempered with acceptance of what is. The people-pleasing patterns that you thought you had completely healed resurface in new contexts, but instead of feeling defeated by their return, you recognize them as opportunities to practice setting boundaries at ever more subtle levels. Each encounter with these familiar patterns becomes a chance to refine your understanding of where healthy consideration of others ends and self-betrayal begins. The spiral path means that no psychological work is ever truly finished, but also that no sincere effort is ever wasted. This cyclical understanding extends to your relationships as well. The marriage that seemed to have resolved all its major issues suddenly encounters a new level of challenge that calls forth qualities of love and commitment that neither partner knew they possessed. The friendship that appeared to have reached a comfortable equilibrium enters a phase of conflict and renegotiation that ultimately deepens the bond between you. The family dynamics that you believed you had transcended through your personal growth work resurface when you become a parent yourself, offering you the opportunity to break generational patterns at an even more fundamental level. Even your relationship with your life purpose reveals this spiral nature. The calling that seemed so clear and definitive in your youth evolves and deepens through the decades, calling you to express your gifts in ways you could never have imagined when you first recognized them. The artist discovers that their creative work must go through seasons of destruction and renewal, that the style and medium that served them for years must sometimes be abandoned to make space for new expressions. The teacher learns that they must periodically return to being a student, that their authority must be continuously renewed through fresh encounters with mystery and uncertainty. The eternal return teaches you that mastery in any domain is not a fixed achievement, but a dynamic relationship, not a destination, but a way of traveling. The master musician still practices scales, not because they have forgotten how to play them, but because each return to these fundamentals reveals new subtleties, new possibilities, new depths of expression. The wise elder still grapples with the same essential questions that occupied them as a young seeker, not because they have learned nothing, but because the questions themselves have revealed greater and greater depths of complexity and mystery. This recognition can be initially disheartening to those who have worked hard on their personal development and hoped to arrive at some final resolution of their psychological patterns. There is a part of us that longs for graduation from the human condition, for a permanent escape from the cycles of suffering and confusion that characterize ordinary consciousness. But the eternal return reveals that the goal is not escape, but participation, not transcendence, but integration, not the elimination of human limitations, but the celebration of what becomes possible when consciousness learns to dance consciously with those limitations. The seasons of nature provide a perfect metaphor for this cyclical understanding. Spring does not represent progress over winter, nor does summer demonstrate superiority to autumn. Each season brings its own gifts, its own necessities, its own particular beauty. The oak tree does not resist the approach of winter or apologize for losing its leaves. It participates fully in each season's requirements, knowing that the death of winter is what makes possible the rebirth of spring. In the same way, consciousness learns to participate fully in each phase of its own cyclical unfolding without judging some phases as better or worse than others. Your understanding of death itself is transformed by this recognition of eternal return. Physical death reveals itself as simply the most dramatic example of the cyclical nature that governs all existence, like the seed that must die to become the plant, like the caterpillar that must dissolve to become the butterfly, like the wave that must crash to become the ocean again. Individual consciousness must periodically release its identification with particular forms in order to participate in larger patterns of becoming. This does not necessarily mean that you adopt any particular beliefs about reincarnation or afterlife, though such beliefs become more comprehensible when viewed through the lens of eternal return. Rather, you begin to sense your individual life as one note in an infinite symphony, one wave in an endless ocean, one breath in the eternal respiration of consciousness itself. Your particular story of growth and learning becomes part of a much larger story in which all beings are continuously cycling through experiences of separation and reunion, forgetting and remembering, dying and being reborn. The recognition of eternal return also transforms your understanding of time itself. Linear time, the time of progress and achievement, of past and future, of before and after, reveals itself as only one dimension of temporal experience. Cyclical time, the time of seasons and cycles, of eternal recurrence, of the ever-present now that is simultaneously the source and destination of all temporal movement, becomes equally real and significant. You begin to live simultaneously in both temporal dimensions, honoring the linear time of your biography while participating in the cyclical time of your deeper nature. This dual relationship with time allows for a more relaxed approach to personal development and spiritual growth. There is less urgency to fix everything right now, less anxiety about whether you are making sufficient progress, less comparison with others who seem to be further along the path. You understand that consciousness unfolds according to its own organic rhythm, that there are seasons for intensive work and seasons for integration, seasons for rapid growth and seasons for patient cultivation. The eternal return also reveals the profound interconnectedness of all beings within the larger cycles of evolutionary consciousness. Your individual journey of awakening is not separate from the collective awakening of humanity, just as humanity's evolution is not separate from the evolution of life itself on this planet. The psychological patterns you are working to integrate are not just your personal issues, but expressions of universal human themes that countless others are also exploring. Your breakthroughs contribute to a morphic field of possibility that makes similar breakthroughs more likely for others. Your healing participates in the healing of ancient wounds that have been passed down through generations. This understanding brings both humility and empowerment. Humility because you recognize that your individual effort is part of a much larger process that extends far beyond your personal life and will. Empowerment because you understand that your sincere engagement with your own growth and healing contributes to the evolution of consciousness itself, that your willingness to face your shadow serves the collective integration of the human shadow, that your commitment to love despite past hurts contributes to the healing of love itself within the human experience. The practical implications of embracing the eternal return are profound. You stop looking for final solutions to complex psychological and spiritual questions and begin to appreciate the ongoing dialogue between different aspects of your nature. You develop what might be called spiral thinking, the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to return to familiar problems with fresh eyes, to find new answers to old questions and new questions in old answers. Your approach to spiritual practice becomes more fluid and responsive to the natural rhythms of your development. Instead of forcing yourself to maintain the same meditation schedule or study program regardless of circumstances, you learn to sense what kind of practice is called for in each season of your inner life. Sometimes the practice is intensive daily sitting. Sometimes it is contemplative walks in nature. Sometimes it is the study of sacred texts. Sometimes it is the practice of conscious service. Sometimes it is solitary retreat. Sometimes it is engaged community involvement. The eternal return teaches you to trust the intelligence of your own unfolding process, even when it does not conform to external expectations or conventional spiritual maps. Your path may lead you away from formal spiritual practice for years, while you integrate insights through relationship and work, then call you back to intensive inner work when you are ready for the next spiral of development. Your spiritual life may alternate between periods of devotional surrender and periods of intellectual inquiry, between phases of mystical experience and phases of practical application. This trust in your own process extends to your relationships with spiritual teachers and teaching systems. You understand that different teachers serve different phases of your development, that the guru who was perfect for your 20s may no longer be relevant to your 50s, that the teaching that opened your heart in one decade may need to be balanced by different wisdom in the next. This is not spiritual promiscuity or lack of commitment, but recognition that consciousness itself is your ultimate teacher, and that it employs whatever forms of instruction are needed for each phase of your journey. The recognition of eternal return also transforms your relationship with success and failure, achievement and setback. These apparent opposites reveal themselves as necessary complementary phases in the larger rhythm of development. The failure that seems so devastating in the moment often proves to be the composting that makes possible an even greater success. The achievement that feels so satisfying often contains the seeds of the next necessary failure. Neither success nor failure is permanent. Both are temporary expressions of consciousness, exploring its own infinite potential. This understanding brings a quality of equanimity to your engagement with life's challenges and opportunities. You can celebrate victories without becoming attached to them, meet defeats without being destroyed by them, Engage fully with whatever arises while maintaining perspective on its temporary nature. This is not indifference or detachment, but rather what Buddhism calls the middle way. Full participation without desperate attachment. Complete engagement without identification. As you mature in this understanding of eternal return, you begin to recognize the same cyclical patterns operating at every scale of existence, in your daily rhythms of waking and sleeping, in your monthly or seasonal fluctuations of energy and mood, in your yearly cycles of planning and review, in your decade-long phases of focus and transition, in your lifetime arcs of innocence and experience and wisdom. Each level of cyclical unfolding offers its own teachings, its own opportunities for conscious participation in the dance of becoming. The ultimate teaching of the eternal return is that consciousness is not trying to get anywhere else, but is celebrating its own infinite creativity by expressing itself through endless cycles of forgetting and remembering, losing and finding, separation and reunion. Your individual life is consciousness playing at being separate from itself so that it can experience the joy of rediscovering its own unity. Your struggles and breakthroughs, your attachments and detachments, your wounds and healings are all expressions of this cosmic game of hide and seek that consciousness plays with itself. This recognition transforms the entire flavor of spiritual seeking. Instead of trying to escape the human condition, you begin to celebrate your participation in it. Instead of looking for permanent transcendence, you appreciate the beauty of temporary form. Instead of seeking final enlightenment, you enjoy the continuous process of awakening to ever subtler dimensions of what is already and always present. The spiral path reveals that every ending is a beginning, every arrival is a departure, every completion opens onto new possibilities. The death of your old identity is the birth of your new self. The dissolution of your familiar world is the emergence of a more inclusive reality. The breakdown of your previous understanding is the breakthrough into greater wisdom. In embracing the eternal return, you step into what might be called evolutionary participation, conscious collaboration with the intelligence that is continuously creating and recreating reality through cycles of destruction and renewal. You become a co-creative partner with the force that turns the seasons, that breathes the tides, that spins the galaxies in their ancient dance of expansion and contraction. This is perhaps the most profound shift of all, from seeing yourself as separate from the evolutionary process to recognizing yourself as one of its most sophisticated expressions, from trying to control or escape the cycles of change to learning to participate in them consciously and creatively. The unbreakable soul is not one that stands outside the eternal return, but one that dances at the very center of it, finding in the ceaseless cycles of transformation, not futility, but the inexhaustible source of life's creative renewal. The journey that began with attachment, that moved through detachment, that discovered integration, that embraced the role of wounded healer, now reveals its ultimate secret. There is no final destination because consciousness itself is the journey. There is no problem to be solved because consciousness is the eternal solution solving itself. There is no goal to be achieved because consciousness is the eternal achievement achieving itself through you, as you, in you, for the sheer joy of being itself in infinite forms. And so the spiral continues, will always continue. Each return a homecoming, each departure an adventure, each cycle a complete universe of possibility exploring its own infinite potential. In accepting the eternal return, you accept your role as consciousness, celebrating its own inexhaustible creativity through the magnificent complexity of human existence. This is your ultimate unbreakability. Not the absence of change, but the capacity to dance joyfully with change. Not the escape from cycles, but the conscious participation in the eternal spiral that has no beginning and no end, only endless depths of beauty, meaning, and mysterious grace.